Hello there, history enthusiasts, and welcome back to another deep dive into the fascinating world of ancient civilizations. I'm Jordan, and today we're embarking on an extraordinary journey to explore one of Anatolia's most enigmatic and remarkable peoples, the Carians. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. The Carians? I've heard of the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, but the Carians? Well, my friends, that's exactly why we're here today. The Carians represent one of those incredible civilizations that somehow managed to slip through the cracks of popular historical consciousness, despite leaving behind a legacy that would influence the ancient world in ways that still echo today. Picture this: it's the height of the ancient world, somewhere between the 8th and 4th centuries BCE. The Mediterranean is bustling with trade, empires are rising and falling, and in the southwestern corner of what we now call Turkey, a remarkable people are carving out their own unique place in history. These are the Carians, warriors, sailors, craftsmen, and innovators who would become legendary throughout the ancient world for their military prowess and their stunning architectural achievements. What makes the Carians particularly fascinating is how they managed to maintain their distinct identity while simultaneously adapting to and influencing the great powers around them. They served as mercenaries for Egyptian pharaohs, fought alongside Persian kings, and yet never lost their essential Carianness. They were cultural chameleons, if you will, but chameleons with a very strong sense of self. Today, we're going to unpack their entire story, from their mysterious origins in the mists of prehistory to their eventual absorption into the Hellenistic world following Alexander the Great's conquests. We'll explore their homeland, walk through their magnificent cities, decipher their unique alphabet, and meet their gods. By the time we're done, you'll understand why the Carians deserve a place right alongside the other great civilizations of the ancient world. So grab your favorite beverage, settle in, and let's travel back in time to ancient Caria. Trust me, this is going to be quite the adventure. Let me start with a question that has puzzled historians for centuries. Where exactly did the Carians come from? This isn't just academic curiosity. Understanding their origins helps us grasp how they became the unique civilization they were. The ancient sources give us some tantalizing clues, though as is often the case with ancient history, these clues sometimes contradict each other. The great historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, tells us that the Carians claimed to be indigenous to their land. Essentially, they believed they had always been there. Now, this is interesting because most ancient peoples had elaborate migration stories. The Greeks had their tales of various tribes moving from place to place. The Romans had Aeneas fleeing Troy. But the Carians? They said, "This has always been our home." But here's where it gets complicated. Herodotus also mentions that some people believed the Carians had originally lived on islands, possibly in the Aegean, and were called Leleges before they settled in mainland Anatolia. According to this version of events, they were displaced by the Dorians and Ionians and eventually made their way to the southwestern coast of Asia Minor, where they established what we know as Caria. Now, modern archaeology has given us some fascinating insights that help resolve this apparent contradiction. The archaeological evidence suggests that the Carians were indeed indigenous to Anatolia, but their culture shows clear signs of having absorbed various waves of migration and cultural influence over many centuries. Think of it like a palimpsest, those ancient manuscripts where new text was written over old text, but traces of the original still show through. What we can say with confidence is that by the 8th century BCE, there was a distinct Carian identity emerging in southwestern Anatolia. These people spoke their own language, had their own religious practices, and had developed a sophisticated political and social organization. They weren't just another Greek colony or a simple tribal confederation. They were something uniquely their own. The linguistic evidence is particularly fascinating here. The Carian language belongs to the Anatolian branch of the Indo-European language family, making it related to Hittite, Luwian, and other ancient Anatolian languages. This suggests deep, ancient roots in the region. But here's the kicker. Carian also shows influences from other language families, indicating centuries of contact and cultural exchange with non-Indo-European peoples. This linguistic mixing bowl tells us something profound about Carian origins. They weren't a people who arrived fully formed with their culture intact. Instead, they appear to have emerged from the complex interaction of indigenous Anatolian populations with various migrating groups over many centuries. It's a process that archaeologists call ethnogenesis, the birth of a new ethnic identity from the mixing of different cultural elements. One of the most compelling theories, supported by both archaeological and linguistic evidence, suggests that the Carians emerged from the collapse of the late Bronze Age civilizations around 1200 BCE. You might know this period as the Bronze Age collapse, a time when many of the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean suddenly disappeared or were dramatically transformed. The Mycenaean palaces in Greece were destroyed, the Hittite Empire collapsed, and the entire region went through a period of upheaval and population movement. During this chaotic period, it seems that various groups in southwestern Anatolia, some indigenous, some refugees from collapsed kingdoms, some opportunistic migrants, gradually coalesced into what would become the Carian people. They took the best elements from each contributing culture, the indigenous knowledge of the land and its resources, the military technologies and techniques of the displaced warrior groups, the maritime skills of island peoples, and the administrative know-how of the old palace civilizations. This process of cultural synthesis explains many of the distinctive features we see in later Carian civilization. Their famous military prowess, for instance, likely combined indigenous Anatolian warrior traditions with innovations learned from displaced Mycenaean and other Bronze Age military elites. Their remarkable adaptability as mercenaries probably grew out of centuries of dealing with different cultural groups within their own society. What's particularly interesting is how this mixed origin gave the Carians a unique perspective on cultural identity. Unlike peoples who saw themselves as descended from a single heroic ancestor or divine founder, the Carians seem to have embraced their multicultural heritage. This made them incredibly adaptable. They could serve Egyptian pharaohs, Persian kings, or Greek tyrants with equal effectiveness, not because they lacked identity, but because their identity was inherently flexible and inclusive. The religious evidence supports this interpretation as well. Carian religion, as we'll explore in more detail later, shows clear signs of being a synthetic system that incorporated elements from various traditions. Their pantheon included indigenous Anatolian deities, Greek gods, and influences from Egypt and the Near East. Rather than seeing this as religious confusion, we should understand it as the natural result of their multicultural origins. By the time we first encounter the Carians in historical sources, primarily through their interactions with the Greek world in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, they had developed a sophisticated and distinctive civilization. They had their own language and writing system, their own political institutions, their own military traditions, and their own religious practices. They were, in other words, a fully formed people with a clear sense of identity, even though that identity had emerged from the mixing of many different cultural streams. This complex origin story helps explain one of the most fascinating aspects of Carian history: their ability to maintain their distinctiveness while participating fully in the broader Mediterranean world. They could be simultaneously Carian and cosmopolitan, indigenous and international, traditional and innovative. It's a balancing act that few ancient peoples managed as successfully as the Carians did. Now that we understand something about Carian origins, let's explore the land that shaped them, the region of Caria itself. Geography, as any historian will tell you, is destiny, and nowhere is this truer than in the case of the Carians. Caria occupied the southwestern corner of Anatolia, in what is now modern-day Turkey. If you're looking at a map, imagine the Aegean Sea stretching out to the west, with numerous islands scattered across its blue expanse. To the north, you'd find Ionia, home to the famous Greek cities like Ephesus and Miletus. To the east lay Lycia, another distinctive Anatolian civilization, and to the southeast, the region gradually merged into Pamphylia and Cilicia. But Caria wasn't just defined by its neighbors. Its internal geography was equally important in shaping Carian civilization. This was a land of dramatic contrasts, rugged mountain ranges giving way to fertile river valleys, rocky coastlines broken by sheltered harbours, and inland plains perfect for agriculture. The landscape itself seemed designed to produce a people who were adaptable, resilient, and opportunistic. Let me paint you a picture of this remarkable region. The Carian heartland was dominated by several major river systems, most notably the Meander River. Yes, the river that gave us our word meander because of its winding serpentine course through the landscape. The Meander Valley was incredibly fertile, supporting dense agricultural settlements and providing a natural highway for trade and communication between the coast and the interior. The coastline of Caria was particularly spectacular and strategically important. It featured numerous deep, protected harbours that made ideal bases for the maritime activities that were so central to Carian life. The coast was also blessed with several excellent natural harbours that could accommodate the largest ships of the ancient world. This maritime orientation wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was fundamental to Carian identity and success. Think about it this way. The Carians were perfectly positioned to take advantage of the great Mediterranean trade networks. Their harbours could service ships travelling between Egypt and the Greek world, between the Black Sea and the Levant, between Mesopotamia and the Western Mediterranean. They weren't just passive observers of this trade, they were active participants, and their geographic position gave them enormous leverage in commercial negotiations. But Caria wasn't just about the coast. The interior regions were equally important, though in different ways. The inland areas were characterized by high plateaus and mountain valleys that provided excellent grazing for livestock and supported a thriving agricultural economy. These interior regions also contained valuable mineral resources, silver, lead, and other metals that were essential to ancient economies. The mountainous terrain of interior Caria also served important defensive functions. Throughout their history, when faced with overwhelming foreign invasion, Carians could retreat into these highland fastnesses and conduct guerrilla warfare against their enemies. The mountains provided natural fortresses that even the most powerful ancient armies found difficult to penetrate. One of the most remarkable features of Carian geography was how it fostered both unity and diversity within Carian society. The river valleys and coastal plains provided natural centres for large settlements and political organisation, while the mountains and hill country supported smaller, more independent communities. This geographic diversity meant that Caria never developed the kind of rigid, centralised political system we see in some other ancient civilizations. Instead, Carian political organisation remained relatively decentralised, with various cities and regions maintaining considerable autonomy even when they were part of larger political structures. This political flexibility, rooted in geographic reality, would prove to be one of the Carians' greatest strengths in dealing with the various foreign powers that sought to control their region. The climate of Caria was Mediterranean in character, hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters. This climate was perfect for the cultivation of olives, grapes and grains that formed the backbone of the ancient Mediterranean economy. Carian agricultural products were highly prized throughout the ancient world, and the region's agricultural prosperity provided the economic foundation for their remarkable urban development. What's particularly interesting about Carian geography is how it influenced their cultural development. The combination of maritime and inland orientations meant that the Carians were simultaneously exposed to foreign influences through their coastal trade connections and rooted in ancient Anatolian traditions through their inland communities. They were cosmopolitan and provincial at the same time, worldly and traditional, innovative and conservative. This geographic situation also helps explain the Carians' famous military reputation. Their homeland provided them with everything they needed to become formidable warriors. The rugged terrain that produced hardy, resilient people. The need to defend valuable trade routes and harbours that gave them practical military experience. And the cultural mixing that exposed them to various military technologies and techniques. The strategic importance of Caria's location cannot be overstated. This region sat at the crossroads of three continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. Any power seeking to control trade between these continents or planning military campaigns across them had to deal with Caria. This gave the Carians enormous political leverage, despite their relatively small population. At the same time, this strategic importance made Caria a target for imperial expansion. Throughout their history, the Carians found themselves courted, threatened, conquered, and liberated by a succession of great powers: the Lydians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. Their geographic position made neutrality almost impossible. They had to choose sides and make alliances to survive. The natural resources of Caria also played a crucial role in their development. Beyond the agricultural products I mentioned, the region was rich in timber, essential for shipbuilding and construction. The mountains yielded high-quality stone that was used for their magnificent architecture. The coastal waters teemed with fish, providing an important protein source for the population. Perhaps most importantly, Caria's geography fostered the development of a maritime culture. The Carians became renowned throughout the ancient world as sailors, shipbuilders, and naval warriors. Their geographic situation made this expertise not just advantageous but absolutely essential. They had to master the sea to survive and prosper. This maritime orientation had profound cultural implications. It made the Carians inherently cosmopolitan and adaptable. A people who live by the sea are constantly dealing with foreign traders, learning about distant lands, and adapting to changing conditions. The sea teaches flexibility, opportunism, and resilience, qualities that would serve the Carians well throughout their turbulent history. Having established the geographic context, let's now explore the urban jewels of Carian civilization, the cities that served as centers of political power, economic activity, and cultural development. These weren't just collections of buildings. They were the beating hearts of Carian society, each with its own character, specializations, and contributions to the broader Carian story. The story of Carian cities begins with Mylasa, the traditional capital and religious center of the Carian Confederation. Located in the interior of Caria, about 50 kilometers from the coast, Mylasa occupied a strategic position that allowed it to control the main routes between the coastal regions and the inland plateaus. But Mylasa was much more than just a convenient location. It was the spiritual and political heart of Carian identity. Picture, if you will, approaching Mylasa in its heyday during the 4th century BCE. The city would have been visible from miles away, its white limestone buildings gleaming in the Anatolian sun, dominated by the massive temple complex dedicated to Zeus Labrondos. This wasn't just any temple. It was the most sacred site in all of Caria, the place where the Carian Confederation would gather for religious festivals and political assemblies. The Temple of Zeus Labrondos tells us something profound about Carian religion and politics. Labrondos was a distinctly Carian deity, a god who combined Zeus-like sky god attributes with distinctly Anatolian characteristics. The double axe, or labris, was his sacred symbol, and this same symbol appeared on Carian coins and royal regalia. The temple served not just as a religious center, but as a symbol of Carian unity and independence. Mylasa was also famous throughout the ancient world for its marble quarries. Carian marble was prized for its quality and beauty, and it was exported throughout the Mediterranean. The wealth generated by these quarries helped finance the city's magnificent buildings and supported a sophisticated urban culture that rivaled anything in the Greek world. But perhaps Mylasa's greatest contribution to world history was as the birthplace of some remarkable individuals who would shape the ancient world. Most famously, it was the ancestral home of the Hecatomnid dynasty, including Mausolus, whose tomb, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, would become one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Now, speaking of Halicarnassus, we come to perhaps the most famous of all Carian cities. Located on the coast, Halicarnassus combined the best of both worlds: maritime accessibility and inland connections. The city was built on a peninsula that jutted into a magnificent natural harbour, providing both excellent port facilities and impressive defensive advantages. Halicarnassus reached its zenith under the rule of Mausolus in the 4th century BCE. Mausolus, a Carian satrap under Persian rule, transformed the city into one of the most magnificent urban centers in the ancient world. He moved the capital of Caria from Mylasa to Halicarnassus, bringing with him not just the seat of government, but also the population of several smaller Carian towns. This synoecism, the process of bringing together multiple communities into a single urban center, was a brilliant political and economic strategy. It created a city large enough to rival the great Greek polis, while maintaining its distinctly Carian character. The new Halicarnassus became a cosmopolitan metropolis, where Carian traditions mixed with Greek, Persian, and Egyptian influences. The most famous feature of Halicarnassus was, of course, the mausoleum, the massive tomb that Mausolus's widow, Artemisia II, built for her husband. This wasn't just a tomb, it was a statement of Carian power and sophistication. The mausoleum combined Greek architectural principles with Carian and Persian decorative elements, creating something entirely new and spectacular. Standing about 45 meters high and decorated with sculptures by the greatest artists of the age, including Scopas and Leocharis, the mausoleum was visible from far out at sea, serving as both a monument to Mausolus and a symbol of Halicarnassus's importance. It's worth noting that the very word mausoleum comes from Mausolus's name, showing how profoundly this Carian creation influenced world culture. But Halicarnassus was more than just the mausoleum. The city was also famous as the birthplace of Herodotus, the father of history. Growing up in this cosmopolitan Carian city, with its mixture of cultures and its position at the crossroads of civilizations, undoubtedly influenced Herodotus's broad, inclusive approach to historical writing. His famous histories reflect the kind of cultural curiosity and tolerance that was characteristic of Carian civilization. Another major Carian city was Cnidus, located on the tip of a peninsula that extended into the Aegean Sea. Cnidus was particularly famous for its double harbour, one facing north toward the Greek islands, the other facing south toward Rhodes and the eastern Mediterranean. This gave Cnidus enormous advantages in maritime trade and made it one of the wealthiest cities in the region. Cnidus was also a major cultural centre, home to a famous school of medicine and the site of one of antiquity's most celebrated sculptures, the Aphrodite of Cnidus by Praxiteles. This statue, which depicted the goddess completely nude, was revolutionary in ancient art and drew visitors from across the Mediterranean world. The city built a special circular temple to house the statue, and the tourism revenue it generated helped support Cnidus's prosperity for centuries. The city of Iassos presents us with a different model of Carian urban development. Located on an island that was connected to the mainland by a causeway, Iassos combined the security advantages of an island location with the economic benefits of mainland connections. The city was particularly famous for its fishing industry. Iasian fish were prized throughout the ancient world for their quality and flavor. Iassos also played an important role in the broader political history of the region. During the Peloponnesian War, it served as a base for various military operations, and its strategic location made it valuable to both Athens and Sparta at different times. The city's ability to maintain its independence and prosperity, despite being caught in the middle of these great power conflicts, demonstrates the political skill that characterized Carian leadership. Caunus, located near the border between Caria and Lycia, offers us insights into how Carian cities dealt with cultural boundaries. The population of Caunus was mixed Carian and Lycian, and the city's culture reflected this diversity. Caunus was famous for its figs, so famous that poor quality figs anywhere in the Mediterranean were called Caunian figs, as an insult. But Caunus was also strategically important because of its location on the trade routes between the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean. The city's harbour could accommodate large merchant vessels, and its position made it a natural stopping point for ships travelling between different regions of the ancient world. What strikes me most about these Carian cities is their diversity and adaptability. Unlike some ancient civilizations where cities followed a standard template, Carian cities each developed their own distinctive character based on their geographic situation, economic opportunities, and cultural circumstances. This diversity was a source of strength. It meant that Carian civilization wasn't dependent on any single urban center, and it could adapt to changing circumstances by drawing on the different specializations of its various cities. The urban planning of Carian cities also reveals important aspects of their society. Unlike the rigid grid patterns we see in some Greek colonial cities, Carian cities typically followed more organic patterns that adapted to local topography and incorporated existing cultural sites. This suggests a society that valued continuity with the past and adaptation to local conditions over imposed uniformity. The public architecture of these cities tells us about Carian values and priorities. Every major Carian city had substantial religious buildings, indicating the continued importance of traditional religious practices. But they also invested heavily in harbours, fortifications, and public spaces that facilitated trade and civic life. This combination of the sacred and the practical, the traditional and the innovative, was characteristic of Carian culture as a whole. Now we come to one of the most fascinating and challenging aspects of Carian studies: their language and the inscriptions they left behind. Language, as we all know, is the key to understanding any civilization, but Carian presents us with a particularly intriguing puzzle. For centuries, scholars could identify Carian inscriptions but couldn't read them. It's only been in recent decades that we've made significant progress in deciphering this ancient tongue, and what we've learned has revolutionized our understanding of Carian civilization. Let me start by setting the scene for you. Imagine being a 19th century archaeologist excavating in southwestern Turkey. You keep finding inscriptions carved in stone, scratched on pottery, or stamped on coins, written in an alphabet that looks vaguely familiar but uses symbols in ways you don't recognize. You can tell it's writing. The symbols are clearly organized into words and sentences, but you can't make heads or tails of what it actually says. This was the situation scholars faced with Carian for over a century. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: bilingual inscriptions found in Egypt. You see, during the 6th and 7th centuries BCE, many Carians served as mercenaries in the armies of Egyptian pharaohs. These Carian soldiers left graffiti and dedicatory inscriptions on the walls of temples and monuments throughout Egypt, often writing the same message in both Carian and Egyptian hieroglyphics or Greek. The most famous of these discoveries came from Abu Simbel, the magnificent temple complex built by Ramesses II in southern Egypt. On the legs of the massive statues that guard the temple entrance, 6th century BCE Carian mercenaries carved their names alongside Greek and Egyptian inscriptions. These bilingual texts provided scholars with the Rosetta Stone they needed to begin deciphering the Carian language. But let me tell you, it wasn't easy. The Carian language belongs to the Anatolian branch of Indo-European, making it related to Hittite and other ancient languages of Asia Minor. However, Carian had evolved in its own direction for centuries, developing unique grammatical features and vocabulary that made it quite distinct from its relatives. Additionally, the Carian writing system presented its own challenges. It used an alphabet derived from Greek letters, but adapted them in ways that reflected the specific sounds of the Carian language. What makes Carian inscriptions particularly valuable is what they tell us about Carian society that we can't learn from foreign sources. Greek and Roman authors often wrote about the Carians, but they saw them from the outside, sometimes with prejudice or misunderstanding. Carian inscriptions, on the other hand, give us the Carian perspective. Their own words about their beliefs, their politics, their daily lives, and their relationships with the world around them. One of the most significant categories of Carian inscriptions consists of religious dedications. These texts reveal a complex religious system that combined indigenous Anatolian elements with Greek, Persian, and Egyptian influences. We find dedications to Zeus Labraundos, the chief Carian deity I mentioned earlier, but also to Greek gods like Apollo and Artemis, and to various local deities whose names appear nowhere else in the ancient record. These religious inscriptions also reveal the international character of Carian society. We find dedications made by individuals with Carian names honoring Greek gods, by people with Greek names honoring Carian deities, and by individuals with Persian or Egyptian names participating in local Carian religious practices. This wasn't cultural confusion. It was sophisticated religious pluralism that allowed people of different backgrounds to participate fully in Carian society. The funerary inscriptions are equally revealing. Carian tombstones often include not just the name of the deceased, but information about their occupation, their family relationships, and sometimes their place of origin. We learn about Carian merchants who died far from home, soldiers who served in foreign armies, craftsmen who specialized in particular trades, and women who held positions of considerable social prominence. One particularly interesting aspect of Carian funerary inscriptions is how they reflect the mobile, cosmopolitan nature of Carian society. We find tombstones of Carians who died in Egypt, Greece, and other distant lands. But we also find tombstones in Caria of people who were clearly from other regions but had been integrated into Carian society. This suggests a culture that was both outward-looking and inclusive. Political inscriptions provide insights into Carian governance and diplomacy. We have treaties between Carian cities and foreign powers, decrees issued by Carian rulers, and records of diplomatic exchanges. These texts reveal a sophisticated political culture that was capable of complex negotiations with major powers while maintaining distinctly Carian institutions and practices. One of the most famous political inscriptions is the bilingual Greek-Carian decree from Kaunos that records an agreement between the city and a Ptolemaic governor in the 3rd century BCE. The fact that this agreement was recorded in both languages suggests that Carian remained an important administrative language, even under foreign rule, and that the Carian population retained significant political autonomy. Commercial inscriptions, found on coins, weights, measures, and commercial documents, reveal the extent and sophistication of Carian trade networks. Carian merchants were active throughout the Mediterranean, and their inscriptions have been found from the Black Sea to North Africa. These texts often include not just commercial information, but also personal messages that reveal the human side of ancient trade. What's particularly fascinating about Carian commercial inscriptions is how they reflect the multilingual nature of Mediterranean commerce. Carian traders were clearly comfortable operating in Greek, Aramaic, Egyptian, and other languages as business required, but they also maintained their own language for internal record-keeping and personal communication. The linguistic analysis of Carian inscriptions has revealed some remarkable features of the language itself. Carian appears to have had a complex system of honorific titles and social designations that reflected the hierarchical but flexible nature of Carian society. The language also shows evidence of extensive borrowing from other languages, but in ways that suggest genuine cultural integration rather than simple foreign influence. One of the most intriguing discoveries has been the identification of distinctly Carian literary or poetic texts. While most surviving Carian inscriptions are practical documents, religious dedications, tombstones, commercial records, a few appear to be more literary in nature. These texts suggest that the Carians had their own tradition of written literature, though most of it has been lost. The geographical distribution of Carian inscriptions tells its own story. While the highest concentration is found in Caria itself, Carian inscriptions have been discovered throughout the eastern Mediterranean. This wide distribution reflects the mobile, cosmopolitan nature of Carian civilization and their active participation in the broader Mediterranean world. Perhaps most importantly, the study of Carian language and inscriptions has revealed that this was a civilization with its own distinctive intellectual and cultural traditions. The Carians weren't just passive recipients of Greek or Persian culture. They were active participants in the creation of Mediterranean civilization, contributing their own ideas, practices, and perspectives to the broader cultural mix. The work of deciphering Carian continues today, with new inscriptions being discovered regularly and our understanding of the language constantly evolving. Each new text adds another piece to the puzzle of Carian civilization, helping us understand not just what the Carians did, but how they understood themselves and their place in the world. Building on our exploration of Carian language and inscriptions, let's delve deeper into one of the most fascinating aspects of Carian civilization: their unique alphabet and writing system. This isn't just a matter of academic interest. Understanding how the Carians wrote gives us profound insights into how they thought, how they organized their society, and how they interacted with the broader ancient world. The Carian alphabet presents us with a perfect example of cultural adaptation and innovation. Like many ancient writing systems, it didn't emerge in isolation, but rather developed through the creative adaptation of existing scripts to meet the specific needs of Carian society. What makes the Carian case particularly interesting is how they took the Greek alphabet, which was itself adapted from the Phoenician script, and modified it in sophisticated ways to represent the unique sounds and structures of their own language. Now, you might wonder why this matters. After all, lots of ancient peoples adapted writing systems from their neighbors, but the Carian approach was particularly creative and reveals important aspects of their culture. Rather than simply borrowing Greek letters wholesale, the Carians carefully analyzed which symbols they needed, which sounds in their language weren't adequately represented by existing Greek letters, and how they could modify or supplement the Greek system to create something that worked perfectly for Carian. The earliest Carian inscriptions we've found date to around the 7th century BCE, though the writing system was probably developed somewhat earlier. These early inscriptions show a script that was clearly related to Greek, but had already developed its own distinctive characteristics. What's remarkable is how consistent these characteristics were across different regions of Caria. This suggests that the writing system was developed through some kind of coordinated effort, probably by educated elites who were familiar with both Greek writing practices and the specific needs of Carian language. Let me describe some of the key features that made the Carian alphabet unique. First, the Carians modified several Greek letters to represent sounds that existed in Carian but not in Greek. They also retained some letters that the Greeks had dropped from earlier versions of their alphabet, suggesting that these letters continued to be useful for writing Carian, even though they were no longer needed for Greek. Perhaps most interestingly, the Carians developed several entirely new letters that don't appear in any other ancient alphabet. These weren't random inventions, they were carefully designed symbols that fit aesthetically with the rest of the alphabet while representing specific Carian sounds. This kind of systematic innovation shows us that the Carians had scholars who understood both linguistic principles and graphic design. The direction of Carian writing also tells us something important about their cultural situation. Early Carian inscriptions were written from right to left, like Phoenician and early Greek. But as Greek influence in the region increased, Carian writing gradually shifted to left-to-right orientation, matching standard Greek practice. This wasn't just a matter of convenience. It reflects the increasing integration of Carian society with the broader Greek-speaking world. However, and this is crucial, even as they adopted Greek writing direction, the Carians maintained their distinctive letter forms and spelling conventions. They were willing to adapt to international standards when it served their purposes, but they weren't willing to abandon their own cultural distinctiveness. This balance between adaptation and independence was characteristic of Carian civilization as a whole. The materials and methods used for Carian writing reveal important aspects of their society and economy. Like other ancient peoples, the Carians wrote on a variety of materials depending on the purpose and permanence required. For monumental inscriptions, religious dedications, royal decrees, major treaties, they used stone, typically the high-quality marble that was quarried locally. These stone inscriptions were often beautifully carved by skilled craftsmen who understood both the technical requirements of letter cutting and the aesthetic principles that made inscriptions visually appealing. For more everyday purposes, the Carians wrote on pottery, metal, and probably on perishable materials like papyrus and leather that haven't survived to the present day. The pottery inscriptions are particularly valuable because they often represent the kind of casual, informal writing that gives us insights into daily life. Names scratched on drinking cups, commercial notations on storage jars, personal messages on small objects. One of the most fascinating aspects of Carian writing is how it reflects the multilingual nature of their society. Many Carian inscriptions include words or phrases borrowed from Greek, and some inscriptions are entirely bilingual, with the same text written in both Carian and Greek. But these aren't crude translations, they're sophisticated adaptations that show deep understanding of both languages. What's particularly interesting is how Carian writers handled Greek loanwords. Rather than simply writing Greek words in Greek letters within Carian texts, They typically adapted Greek words to Carian spelling conventions, writing them with Carian letters according to Carian phonological rules. This suggests that these borrowed words had been truly integrated into spoken Carian, rather than being kept separate as foreign elements. The social implications of Carian literacy are also worth considering. The distribution and content of Carian inscriptions suggest that literacy was fairly widespread, at least among the urban population. We find Carian inscriptions not just on major monuments, but on everyday objects, suggesting that ordinary people, merchants, craftsmen, soldiers, were comfortable writing in their own language. This widespread literacy had important political and cultural implications. It meant that Carian identity could be maintained and transmitted even when Carians were living far from their homeland. A Carian merchant in Egypt or a Carian soldier serving in a Persian army could maintain connection to Carian culture through the ability to read and write in the Carian language. The religious uses of Carian writing deserve special attention. Many of the surviving Carian inscriptions are religious in nature: dedicatory inscriptions in temples, funerary texts on tombstones, sacred laws regulating religious practices. These inscriptions reveal a sophisticated religious culture that used writing not just for record-keeping, but as an integral part of religious practice itself. Some Carian religious inscriptions appear to have had ritual or magical functions. The act of writing itself was seen as having power, not just the content of what was written. We find inscriptions that were clearly meant to be permanent records of human communication with the divine, creating lasting bonds between mortals and gods. The evolution of Carian script over time also tells us about changing political and cultural circumstances. During periods of Persian rule, we see some Persian influences creeping into Carian writing, not in the basic alphabet, but in decorative elements and inscription formats. Similarly, during periods of increased Greek influence, Carian inscriptions began to adopt more Greek-style formatting and decorative conventions. But perhaps most remarkably, even as Carian writing evolved and adapted to changing circumstances, it maintained its essential character. A Carian inscription from the 3rd century BCE is clearly recognizable as being written in the same tradition as one from the 6th century BCE, despite 3 centuries of political upheaval and cultural change. The technical aspects of Carian stone cutting and inscription making reveal a high level of craftsmanship and artistic sophistication. Carian stonecutters developed distinctive techniques for creating letters that were both aesthetically pleasing and highly legible. They paid careful attention to spacing, alignment, and proportion, creating inscriptions that were as much works of art as they were functional texts. This attention to aesthetic quality wasn't just vanity. It reflected the important social and political functions that written texts served in Carian society. A beautifully executed inscription demonstrated the wealth, sophistication, and cultural refinement of whoever commissioned it, whether that was an individual, a family, or a city-state. The study of Carian paleography, the analysis of how letter forms changed over time, has provided valuable insights into Carian history and chronology. By tracking how specific letters evolved, scholars can often date inscriptions quite precisely and trace the development of different regional traditions within the broader Carian cultural sphere. What emerges from all this evidence is a picture of a writing system that was both practical and sophisticated, adapted to local needs while remaining connected to broader Mediterranean traditions. The Carian alphabet wasn't just a tool for recording information. It was an expression of Carian cultural identity and intellectual achievement. As we delve into the spiritual world of the Carians, we encounter one of the most fascinating and complex religious systems of the ancient Mediterranean. Carian religion wasn't a simple, unified set of beliefs and practices. It was a dynamic, evolving system that successfully integrated indigenous Anatolian traditions with influences from Greece, Persia, Egypt, and other cultures the Carians encountered through their extensive travels and trade networks. At the heart of Carian religion stood Zeus Labrandos, whom I mentioned earlier when we discussed the city of Mylassa. But Labrandos wasn't simply the Greek Zeus with a different name. He was a distinctly Carian deity who embodied the unique spiritual sensibilities of Carian culture. The god's name derives from labris, the double-headed axe that was his sacred symbol and one of the most recognizable elements of Carian religious iconography. The labris itself tells us something profound about Carian religious thinking. This wasn't just a weapon or a tool elevated to divine status. It was a complex symbol that represented the dual nature of divine power. The double-headed axe could create and destroy, could clear forests for agriculture, and defend communities from enemies, could be used in sacrifice to honor the gods and in war to protect the people. In the hands of Zeus Labrondos, the labris represented the god's power over both the natural and human worlds. The great sanctuary of Zeus Labrondos at Labronda, about 20 kilometers northeast of Mylasa, was one of the most important religious sites in all of Anatolia. Picture, if you will, approaching this sacred place in ancient times. You would have traveled along a sacred road lined with monuments and smaller shrines, gradually ascending into the mountains until you reached the great temple complex itself. The sanctuary wasn't just a single building. It was an extensive complex that included the main temple, smaller shrines to associated deities, treasury buildings, dining halls for ritual feasts, and accommodations for pilgrims. The whole complex was designed to create a sense of ascending from the ordinary world into the divine realm, with each building positioned to take advantage of the dramatic mountain landscape. What made Labronda particularly special was its role as a pan-Carian religious center. During major festivals, Carians from throughout the region would gather at the sanctuary to participate in rituals, conduct business, arrange marriages, and reaffirm their shared cultural identity. These gatherings weren't just religious events, they were crucial political and social institutions that helped maintain Carian unity despite their decentralized political organization. But Zeus Labrondos wasn't the only deity in the Carian pantheon. The Carians worshipped a rich variety of gods and goddesses that reflected both their indigenous traditions and their cosmopolitan outlook. Artemis was particularly important, though the Carian version of this goddess had distinctly Anatolian characteristics that set her apart from her Greek counterpart. The Carian Artemis was closely associated with nature and fertility, but also with protection of cities and warfare. This combination might seem contradictory to modern minds, but it made perfect sense in the ancient world, where the same divine forces that ensured agricultural prosperity also had to be called upon to defend the community from enemies. The goddess represented the fierce protective power of nature itself. Apollo also played an important role in Carian religion, particularly in his aspect as a god of prophecy and healing. The Carians established several important oracular sites where people could consult the god about the future, seek healing for illnesses, or ask for divine guidance in important decisions. These oracles weren't just local institutions, they attracted visitors from throughout the Mediterranean world and helped spread Carian religious influence far beyond their homeland. One of the most interesting aspects of Carian religion was how it dealt with foreign deities. Rather than rejecting foreign gods or treating them as inferior to native ones, the Carians typically found ways to integrate them into their existing religious system. When they encountered Egyptian deities through their service as mercenaries in Egypt, for example, they didn't simply adopt Egyptian religious practices wholesale. Instead, they identified points of similarity between Egyptian and Carian deities and created synthetic religious forms that honored both traditions. This religious syncretism, the blending of different religious traditions, was characteristic of Carian culture as a whole. It reflected their practical, inclusive approach to cultural differences and their confidence in their own religious traditions. The Carians were secure enough in their own spiritual identity to learn from others without losing themselves in the process. The role of women in Carian religion deserves special attention. Unlike some ancient cultures where religious authority was exclusively male, Carian religion included important roles for priestesses and female religious officials. Some of our most important Carian religious inscriptions were commissioned by women who held significant religious offices and clearly wielded considerable spiritual authority. This religious prominence of women reflected broader patterns in Carian society. Carian women appear to have enjoyed more social freedom and political influence than women in many other ancient cultures. The famous Artemisia and Artemisia Sue, who ruled as queens of Halicarnassus, weren't anomalies. They represented a tradition of female leadership that had deep roots in Carian culture. Funeral practices and beliefs about the afterlife provide another window into Carian religious thinking. Carian tombs and burial practices show a complex mixture of influences combining indigenous Anatolian traditions with elements borrowed from Greek, Persian, and Egyptian practices. But these weren't random borrowings. They were carefully selected and adapted elements that fit with Carian beliefs about death and the afterlife. The famous rock-cut tombs of Caria, carved directly into cliff faces and decorated with elaborate architectural details, represent one of the most distinctive forms of Carian religious art. These tombs weren't just places to deposit the dead. They were designed as eternal homes for the deceased, complete with furniture, decorative elements, and provisions for the afterlife journey. Many Carian tombs include religious inscriptions that reveal beliefs about the relationship between the living and the dead. The dead weren't seen as completely separated from the world of the living. They continued to play important roles in family and community life, requiring ongoing care and attention from their descendants. The mystery religions also found fertile ground in Caria. These secretive religious cults, which promised initiates special knowledge about the divine world and privileged status in the afterlife, were particularly popular among the cosmopolitan urban populations of Carian cities. The mystery cults appealed to people who traveled widely and encountered different religious systems. They offered a way to participate in exclusive spiritual communities that transcended local ethnic and political boundaries. Carian participation in mystery religions wasn't just passive adoption of foreign practices. Carian religious innovators contributed their own elements to mystery cult practices, creating distinctive local variants that reflected Carian spiritual sensibilities. Some mystery cult practices that are often thought of as purely Greek actually show clear signs of Carian influence and innovation. The economic aspects of Carian religion were also significant. The great sanctuaries weren't just spiritual centers. They were major economic institutions that controlled substantial resources and played important roles in regional commerce. The sanctuary of Zeus Labrandos, for example, owned extensive lands, controlled lucrative quarries, and received regular offerings from throughout the Carian world. These religious economic networks helped bind Carian society together and provided alternative sources of authority and organization that complemented the political structures of the various Carian cities. When political unity was difficult to achieve, religious unity could still be maintained through shared participation in major sanctuaries and festivals. The festivals themselves were spectacular affairs that combined religious ritual with athletic competitions, artistic performances, commercial activities, and social celebrations. The Great Festival of Zeus Labrandos, held annually at the Labronda Sanctuary, was one of the major events in the ancient Mediterranean calendar, attracting visitors from throughout the region and serving as a showcase for Carian culture and prosperity. These festivals weren't just entertainment, they were crucial institutions for maintaining and transmitting Carian culture. Young people learned traditional songs, dances, and stories. Craftsmen displayed their finest work. Merchants conducted important business deals. And political leaders negotiated agreements and settled disputes. The festivals were, in many ways, the glue that held Carian society together. The artistic expressions of Carian religion, sculpture, painting, decorative arts, and architecture, represent some of the finest achievements of ancient Mediterranean culture. Carian religious art combined indigenous Anatolian traditions with the best elements of Greek, Persian, and Egyptian artistic practices, creating distinctive synthetic styles that influenced artistic development throughout the region. The religious architecture of Caria was particularly influential. The combination of Greek architectural principles with Carian decorative sensibilities and Persian monumental concepts created buildings that were both functionally effective and aesthetically stunning. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus, while technically a tomb rather than a temple, represented the culmination of this distinctive Carian religious architectural tradition. As we consider the full scope of Carian religion, what emerges is a picture of a spiritual system that was both deeply rooted in local traditions and remarkably open to external influences. The Carians managed to maintain their distinctive religious identity, while participating fully in the broader Mediterranean religious world. Their gods were recognizably Carian, but they could communicate with Greek, Persian, and Egyptian deities. Their rituals followed ancient Anatolian patterns, but they incorporated innovations learned from other cultures. This religious sophistication and flexibility was one of the keys to Carian success in the ancient world. It allowed them to serve foreign rulers without compromising their fundamental identity, to participate in international networks while maintaining their local distinctiveness, and to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving their essential cultural character. Having explored the internal aspects of Carian civilization, their cities, language, religion, and culture, let's now turn our attention to how the Carians interacted with the broader ancient world. This is where the Carian story becomes truly remarkable, because these people from southwestern Anatolia managed to play roles far beyond what their relatively small population and territory might suggest. The Carians' first major appearance on the international stage was as mercenaries in the armies of foreign powers, particularly Egypt. Beginning in the 7th century BCE, Carian warriors began serving the pharaohs of the 26th dynasty, the Sate period, when Egypt was experiencing a renaissance after centuries of foreign domination and internal strife. Now, you might wonder why Egyptian pharaohs would hire foreign mercenaries when they had their own armies. The answer lies in the changing nature of ancient warfare and the particular skills that Carian warriors brought to the battlefield. By the 7th century BCE, warfare in the eastern Mediterranean had become increasingly sophisticated and professional. The old models of citizen soldiers and feudal levies were giving way to trained, professional armies equipped with the latest military technologies. The Carians had several advantages that made them particularly valuable as mercenaries. First, their homeland's rugged terrain and constant low-level warfare between cities had produced a population of hardy, experienced fighters. Second, their maritime culture meant they were comfortable with travel and adapted easily to fighting in foreign environments. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they had developed a reputation for loyalty and effectiveness that made them highly sought after by rulers throughout the ancient world. But Carian military service wasn't just about individual warriors hiring themselves out as soldiers. The Carians developed a sophisticated system of military contracting that allowed them to provide entire units, infantry, cavalry, naval forces, complete with their own officers and support personnel. These weren't just collections of individual fighters. They were organized military formations that could be integrated into larger armies while maintaining their distinctive Carian character and methods. The evidence for Carian military service is found throughout the ancient world. At Abu Simbel in southern Egypt, as I mentioned earlier, Carian soldiers carved their names alongside Greek and Egyptian inscriptions, creating some of our earliest evidence for the Carian language. But this wasn't just idle graffiti. These inscriptions record the names of men who had traveled thousands of miles from their homeland to serve in the armies of foreign kings. In Egypt, Carian mercenaries served not just as ordinary soldiers, but as members of elite guard units that protected the pharaoh himself. This level of trust and responsibility indicates that the Carians had developed not just military skills, but also the diplomatic and cultural sophistication necessary to function effectively in foreign courts. The relationship between Caria and Egypt went beyond simple military service. Carian merchants followed the soldiers, establishing trading networks that brought Egyptian goods to Anatolia and Carian products to the Nile Valley. These commercial connections helped spread Egyptian cultural influences in Caria. We see this in Carian art, architecture, and religious practices, while also introducing Egyptian elites to Carian innovations and perspectives. The Persian period, beginning with Cyrus the Great's conquest of Anatolia in the 540s BCE, opened new chapters in Carian international involvement. Rather than simply resisting Persian expansion, the Carians chose to work within the Persian system, eventually becoming one of the most trusted and influential groups within the Persian Empire. This wasn't a matter of simple submission or collaboration. The Carians negotiated their entry into the Persian system from a position of strength, maintaining substantial autonomy while contributing their military and administrative skills to Persian imperial administration. Carian nobles served as satraps, provincial governors, not just in their homeland, but throughout the Persian Empire. The most famous example of Carian success within the Persian system was the Hecatomnid dynasty, which ruled Caria as Persian satraps for much of the 4th century BCE. Under rulers like Mausolus and Artemisia II, Caria experienced unprecedented prosperity and cultural achievement, while remaining technically subject to Persian authority. Mausolus, in particular, represents the pinnacle of Carian international influence. As satrap, he controlled not just Caria but substantial parts of the Aegean world. He was involved in major international conflicts, including the social war between Athens and its allies. His court at Halicarnassus became a center of international diplomacy where representatives from throughout the Mediterranean world came to negotiate treaties and seek support for their various causes. But Mausolus wasn't just a successful politician and military leader, he was also a cultural patron whose influence extended far beyond the political sphere. The artists and architects he employed came from throughout the Greek world, and the projects he sponsored, particularly the mausoleum, became models that influenced artistic development for centuries. The Carian relationship with the Greek world was particularly complex and important. Unlike some other Anatolian peoples, the Carians weren't simply passive recipients of Greek cultural influence. They were active participants in Greek cultural development, contributing their own innovations and perspectives to the broader Greek cultural synthesis. Carian participation in Greek religious festivals, their patronage of Greek artists and philosophers, and their involvement in Greek political affairs all demonstrate their full integration into the Greek cultural sphere. Yet they maintained their distinctive Carian identity throughout this process, creating a unique synthesis that was neither purely Greek nor purely indigenous. The famous historian Herodotus exemplifies this Carian Greek cultural synthesis. Born in Halicarnassus to a family that was probably of mixed Carian and Greek ancestry, Herodotus wrote in Greek and is considered one of the founders of Greek historical writing. Yet his approach to history, his curiosity about foreign cultures, his willingness to take seriously the perspectives of non-Greeks, his interest in the complex interactions between different peoples, reflects the cosmopolitan, multicultural environment of Carian cities. During the great conflicts between Greece and Persia in the 5th century BCE, the Carians found themselves in the difficult position of having ties to both sides. Some Carian communities supported the Greek cause, particularly during the Ionian Revolt of 499–494 BCE. Others remained loyal to Persian authority. This division wasn't necessarily a source of weakness. It demonstrated the political sophistication of Carian leadership and their ability to pursue different strategies simultaneously. The aftermath of Alexander the Great's conquest of the Persian Empire in the 330s BCE opened yet another chapter in Carian international involvement. As the Hellenistic kingdoms that succeeded Alexander's empire struggled for control of the eastern Mediterranean, the Carians once again proved adept at navigating complex international politics. Under Ptolemaic rule in Egypt, Carians continued to serve as military officers and administrators. But now within a Greek-speaking bureaucratic system, under Seleucid rule in Syria and Anatolia, they played similar roles. When the Romans began expanding into the eastern Mediterranean, the Carians managed the transition to Roman rule with the same skill they had shown in dealing with previous imperial powers. Throughout all these political changes, what's remarkable is how the Carians maintained their cultural distinctiveness. They continued to speak their own language, worship their own gods, and maintain their own social and cultural institutions, even while participating fully in the broader Mediterranean world. This wasn't cultural stubbornness or isolation. It was a sophisticated strategy that allowed them to contribute to and benefit from international connections, while preserving what was uniquely valuable about their own heritage. The Carian diaspora, the communities of Carians who settled throughout the Mediterranean world, played crucial roles in maintaining these international connections. Carian merchants, soldiers, craftsmen, and scholars could be found from Spain to Central Asia, creating networks of communication and exchange that helped spread Carian influence far beyond their homeland. These diaspora communities weren't just collections of individual emigrants. They maintained organized communities with their own institutions, religious practices, and cultural activities. They served as bridges between their new homes and their Carian homeland, facilitating the flow of ideas, goods, and people in both directions. As we approach the end of our journey through Carian history, we come to one of the most poignant and instructive chapters: the gradual decline of independent Carian political power and the eventual integration of Carian territories into larger imperial systems. This isn't a story of sudden collapse or military defeat, but rather a gradual process of political and cultural transformation that unfolded over several centuries. The beginning of the end for independent Caria can be traced to the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 330s BCE, when Alexander's armies swept through Anatolia. On their way to conquer the Persian Empire, the Carian satraps faced an impossible choice. They could resist Alexander and face almost certain military defeat, or they could submit and hope to maintain some degree of autonomy under Macedonian rule. The last great Carian ruler, Ada of Caria, chose submission but managed to negotiate remarkably favorable terms. Ada was the sister of Mausolus and had been displaced from power by her brother Pixodarus during a family power struggle. When Alexander arrived in Caria, she offered to support his campaign in exchange for restoration to power. Alexander agreed, and Ada became one of his most trusted local allies. This arrangement worked well for both parties during Alexander's lifetime, but his death in 323 BCE created a power vacuum that would ultimately prove fatal to Carian independence. The wars of succession among Alexander's generals, the Diadochi, turned the eastern Mediterranean into a battleground where local autonomy became increasingly difficult to maintain. Initially, Caria fell under the control of Antigonus' firm Monophthalmus, one of Alexander's most ambitious successors. Antigonus appreciated Carian military and naval capabilities and incorporated Carian forces into his armies. But when Antigonus was defeated and killed at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE, Caria was divided between the Ptolemaic and Seleucid kingdoms. Under Ptolemaic rule, based in Egypt, the Carians initially maintained considerable autonomy. The Ptolemies, like the Persians before them, recognized the value of local knowledge and cooperation. They appointed Carian nobles to important administrative positions and allowed traditional Carian institutions to continue functioning. Many Carians served in Ptolemaic armies and navies, continuing their ancient tradition of military service to foreign powers. However, the Ptolemaic system was fundamentally different from the Persian system that had allowed the Hecatomnids to flourish. The Hellenistic kingdoms were more centralized and bureaucratic, leaving less room for the kind of autonomous local rule that had characterized Caria under Persian administration. Gradually, real power shifted away from traditional Carian institutions toward Greek-speaking administrators appointed from Alexandria. The cultural implications of this political change were profound. While Carian language, religion, and customs didn't disappear overnight, they began to lose their public prominence. Greek became increasingly important for anyone seeking advancement in government, the military, or commerce. Young Carian elites found it advantageous to acquire Greek education and adopt Greek cultural practices. This process of Hellenization wasn't necessarily forced or unwelcome. Many Carians saw Greek culture as sophisticated and cosmopolitan, and they embraced it enthusiastically. The problem was that this cultural assimilation gradually weakened the institutions and practices that had maintained Carian distinctiveness for centuries. The rise of Roman power in the eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd century BCE accelerated these trends. The Romans were even more systematic than the Hellenistic kingdoms in imposing uniform administrative and legal systems throughout their territories. While they generally tolerated local customs and religions, they showed little interest in maintaining the kind of political autonomy that had allowed Carian culture to flourish under Persian and early Hellenistic rule. The final blow to Carian political independence came in 129 BCE, when the Romans organized their conquests in western Anatolia into the province of Asia. Caria became part of this province, governed directly by Roman officials according to Roman law. Traditional Carian political institutions were either abolished or reduced to purely ceremonial functions. Yet even under direct Roman rule, Carian culture showed remarkable persistence. Carian inscriptions continued to be carved well into the Roman period, indicating that the language remained in use for religious and commemorative purposes, even after it had largely disappeared from official and commercial contexts. The great Carian sanctuaries continued to function, though increasingly under Roman oversight and according to Roman religious law. The transformation of Carian cities under Roman rule illustrates both the losses and adaptations of this period. Cities like Halicarnassus and Cnidus were rebuilt according to Roman urban planning principles, with forums, basilicas, theatres, and baths replacing or supplementing older Carian architectural forms. These new buildings were often magnificent and represented substantial investments in urban infrastructure, but they also represented the gradual replacement of distinctly Carian urban culture with more standardized Roman forms. The Roman period also saw significant changes in Carian society and economy. The Romans developed new agricultural techniques and crops, expanded mining operations, and integrated Carian territories more fully into Mediterranean-wide trade networks. These changes brought prosperity to many Carians, but also disrupted traditional social relationships and economic patterns. Perhaps most significantly, the Romans introduced new legal and social categories that gradually replaced traditional Carian forms of social organization. Roman citizenship became available to increasing numbers of Carians, particularly urban elites, but obtaining Roman citizenship often meant abandoning or downplaying Carian cultural practices that were seen as incompatible with Roman identity. By the 1st century CE, the process of cultural transformation was largely complete. While people of Carian ancestry continued to live in their ancestral territories, and some traditional practices persisted at the local level, Caria as a distinct political and cultural entity had largely ceased to exist. The region had become part of the broader Roman world, with its inhabitants increasingly identifying themselves as Romans rather than Carians. However, this apparent disappearance of Carian culture was not complete or permanent. Recent archaeological and linguistic research has revealed the persistence of Carian elements in local culture well into the Roman and Byzantine periods. Traditional religious practices continued at rural sanctuaries. Carian artistic motifs appeared in Roman period decorative arts, and Carian place names and personal names persisted long after the language itself had ceased to be spoken. As we reach the end of our exploration of Carian civilization, it's worth reflecting on what we can learn from their remarkable story. The Carians represent something unique in ancient history, a people who successfully navigated the complex world of Mediterranean politics and culture while maintaining their distinctive identity for over a millennium. What made the Carians successful wasn't military might or territorial expansion, though they were certainly skilled warriors when necessary. Instead, their success lay in their adaptability, their openness to learning from others, and their ability to contribute meaningfully to the various political and cultural systems they encountered. The Carian approach to cultural contact offers lessons that remain relevant today. They showed that it's possible to be both proudly local and genuinely cosmopolitan, to maintain traditional values while embracing beneficial innovations, to serve foreign powers without losing one's essential identity. In our own globalized world, where local cultures face pressure from dominant international systems, the Carian example suggests strategies for cultural survival and adaptation. The Carian legacy in the ancient world was substantial and lasting. Their military innovations influenced the development of professional armies throughout the Mediterranean. Their architectural achievements, exemplified by the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, established principles that influenced building design for centuries. Their religious syncretism provided models for the kind of cultural integration that characterized the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. Perhaps most importantly, the Carians demonstrated that small peoples could play significant roles in world history through intelligence, adaptability, and cultural sophistication, rather than through conquest and domination. They showed that diversity and pluralism could be sources of strength rather than weakness, that cultural mixing could produce innovations and insights unavailable to more isolated societies. The modern rediscovery of Carian civilization, made possible by the decipherment of their language and the careful archaeological investigation of their cities and sanctuaries, has enriched our understanding of the ancient Mediterranean world. It has revealed the complexity and sophistication of societies that were previously dismissed as marginal or primitive, and it has highlighted the importance of cultural exchange and adaptation in human history. Today, as we face our own challenges of cultural contact and global integration, the Carian example offers both inspiration and instruction. They show us that it's possible to maintain local identity while participating fully in international systems, to preserve traditional values while adapting to changing circumstances, to be both rooted and cosmopolitan. The story of the Carians reminds us that history is not just the story of great empires and famous individuals, but also the story of peoples who found creative ways to thrive in the spaces between the great powers, who contributed to human civilization through cultural innovation rather than military conquest, who left their mark on the world through the quality of their ideas rather than the extent of their territories. As we conclude our journey through Carian history, we're left with a deeper appreciation for the complexity and richness of the ancient world, and perhaps a better understanding of how small peoples with big ideas can shape the course of human civilization. The Carians may not have conquered empires, but they conquered something perhaps more valuable, the respect and admiration of their contemporaries and the lasting place in history that comes from genuine cultural achievement. Their story reminds us that in the grand sweep of human history, it's often not the loudest voices or the strongest armies that have the most lasting impact, but the creative, adaptable, and culturally sophisticated peoples who find ways to contribute meaningfully to the broader human story. The Carians were such a people, and their legacy continues to enrich our understanding of what human societies can achieve when they combine local pride with global perspective, traditional wisdom with innovative thinking, and cultural distinctiveness with generous openness to the wider world. In the end, the Carians teach us that survival and success in a complex world require not just strength or stubbornness, but intelligence, adaptability, and the wisdom to know when to hold fast to tradition and when to embrace change. These lessons, drawn from the dust of ancient Anatolia, remain as relevant today as they were 2.5 millennia ago. Thank you for joining me on this fascinating journey through the history of one of the ancient world's most remarkable and instructive civilizations. Until next time, this is Jordan, reminding you that history is not just about the past. It's about understanding the human experience in all its complexity and learning from the wisdom of those who came before us. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking, the who, and that's exactly why I'm so excited to share this story with you today. The Carians were a remarkable people who lived in what is now southwestern Turkey, in a region called Caria, and their influence stretched far beyond their mountainous homeland. They were warriors, artists, architects, and innovators who left an indelible mark on the ancient world, even though their story often gets overshadowed by their more famous neighbors, the Greeks, Persians, and Romans. Picture, if you will, the rugged coastline of ancient Anatolia around 1200 BCE. The Mediterranean laps against rocky shores, while inland, steep mountains rise toward a brilliant blue sky. This is Caria, a land of natural harbors, fertile valleys, and strategic mountain passes. It's here that our story begins, with a people who would become legendary for their military prowess, stunning architecture, and complex relationships with the great powers of their time. What makes the Carians so fascinating is that they managed to maintain their distinct identity for over a millennium, adapting and thriving through waves of Greek colonization, Persian conquest, and Hellenistic transformation. They gave us one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, revolutionized mercenary warfare, and created some of the most stunning funerary art ever discovered. Yet somehow, their story remains largely untold in popular history. So grab your favorite beverage, settle in, and let's uncover the remarkable tale of the Carians, from their mysterious origins to their lasting legacy that still echoes through the ruins scattered across modern-day Turkey. To understand the Carians, we need to travel back to the Bronze Age collapse, that catastrophic period around 1200 BCE, when the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Hittites, Mycenaeans, and others, crumbled under waves of invasion, climate change, and social upheaval. It's from this chaos that the Carians emerge into the historical record. The ancient sources give us tantalizing glimpses of Carian origins. Homer, in his Iliad, mentions them as allies of Troy, describing them as speaking a barbarous tongue, which in Greek terminology simply meant they didn't speak Greek. But here's where it gets interesting. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Carians weren't newcomers to Anatolia at all. They appear to have been indigenous people who had lived in this region for centuries, possibly millennia. The great Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, tells us that the Carians themselves claimed to be indigenous to their land, though the Cretans insisted they were originally from the islands and had migrated to the mainland. This debate over Carian origins reflects something profound about ancient identity. These weren't people who fit neatly into our modern categories of ethnicity or nationality. What we do know is that by the 8th century BCE, Caria had developed into a patchwork of city-states and tribal territories, each with its own character but sharing a common Carian identity. The landscape itself shaped their development. Those steep mountains and deep valleys created natural boundaries that fostered local autonomy, while the coastline provided access to maritime trade, networks that would make many Carian cities wealthy and cosmopolitan. The early Carian settlements tell a story of adaptation and innovation. Take Mylasa, one of their most important cities, nestled in a fertile inland valley. Here, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of sophisticated urban planning from as early as the 7th century BCE. Wide streets, elaborate water management systems, and public spaces that speak to a highly organized society. Or consider Halicarnassus, perched on its peninsula overlooking the Aegean, which would later become famous as the site of one of the world's most magnificent monuments. But perhaps most intriguingly, the Carians developed a unique approach to warfare that would make them famous throughout the ancient world. Unlike many ancient peoples who fought primarily to defend their own territory, the Carians became professional soldiers, the ancient world's first true mercenaries. This wasn't born from desperation or poverty, but from a calculated recognition that their mountainous homeland had produced some of the finest warriors in the Mediterranean. Before we delve deeper into Carian history, we need to address their place in the mythological landscape of the ancient world. Because for the Greeks, and through them, for us, myth and history were often intertwined in ways that reveal deep truths about how ancient peoples understood themselves and their place in the world. The Carians' most famous mythological appearance comes in Homer's Iliad, where they're listed among the allies of Troy. Now, this might seem like a minor detail, but it's actually quite significant. Homer describes them as led by Nastes, a man beautiful as a god, who came to war wearing gold ornaments like a girl, a description that likely reflects actual Carian customs of elaborate personal adornment that the more austere Greeks found noteworthy. But here's what makes this really interesting. The Carians in the Iliad aren't portrayed as barbarians or inferior fighters. They're presented as legitimate allies, worthy opponents who chose to stand with Troy against the Greek coalition. This suggests that even in the earliest Greek literary traditions, the Carians were recognized as a significant military power. The mythological connection to Troy wasn't just literary flourish, it reflected real historical relationships. Archaeological evidence from sites across Caria shows strong connections to Trojan culture during the late Bronze Age. Similar pottery styles, architectural techniques, and religious practices suggest that the Carians and Trojans were part of a broader Anatolian cultural sphere that was distinct from, and often opposed to, the Greek world. There's another fascinating mythological thread involving the Carians and the cult of Zeus. According to various ancient sources, the Carians claim to be among the first peoples to worship Zeus Carios, a specifically Carian version of the king of the gods. Some scholars have suggested that certain aspects of Zeus worship actually originated in Caria and spread to the Greek world, rather than the other way around. Whether or not this is historically accurate, it shows how the Carians saw themselves as equal participants in the religious and cultural developments of the ancient Mediterranean. The mythological record also preserves hints of the Carians' reputation as seafarers and traders. Various Greek myths reference Carian merchants and sailors reaching distant shores, bringing exotic goods and foreign knowledge. This mythological reputation would prove to be grounded in historical reality. The Carians were indeed among the most active maritime traders of their era. What's particularly striking about these mythological references is that they consistently portray the Carians as sophisticated, wealthy, and militarily formidable. They're never depicted as primitive or backward, but rather as a people with their own distinct culture and considerable power. This mythological respect would translate into very real political and military relationships as we move into the historical period. Religion in ancient Caria was a fascinating blend of indigenous Anatolian traditions and influences from across the Mediterranean world. The Carians weren't just passive recipients of foreign, religious ideas. They were active innovators who created some of the most distinctive sacred spaces in the ancient world. Let me take you to one of the most remarkable of these sites, the Sanctuary of Zeus at Lebronda. Picture this. High in the mountains above Mylasa, accessible only by a sacred road that winds through dramatic landscapes, sits a sanctuary that was already ancient when Alexander the Great visited it. The very name Labronda comes from labris, the double axe that was both a sacred symbol and a practical tool throughout Anatolia. What makes Labronda so special isn't just its dramatic setting. Though, I have to say, if you ever get the chance to visit the ruins, the view alone will take your breath away. It's the way the Carians integrated their religious practices with their political and social life. This wasn't just a temple where people came to worship. It was a center of Carian identity, a place where tribal leaders gathered to make important decisions, and where religious festivals reinforced social bonds. The temple complex at Labronda underwent continuous expansion and renovation over centuries, reflecting the growing wealth and sophistication of Carian society. The most impressive phase came during the 4th century BCE under the satrap Mausolus. Yes, the same Mausolus whose tomb became a wonder of the world. He transformed Labronda into one of the most magnificent sanctuaries in Anatolia, with marble terraces, elaborate banquet halls, and a temple that rivaled anything in Athens or Ephesus. But Labronda wasn't unique. Throughout Caria, we find evidence of sophisticated religious architecture that reflects both local traditions and international influences. At Knidos, the famous sanctuary of Aphrodite attracted pilgrims from across the Mediterranean, not least because it housed Praxiteles' revolutionary nude statue of the goddess, the first major nude female sculpture in Greek art. The Cnidian Aphrodite was so famous that people would sail from far-off lands just to see it. The religious practices we can reconstruct from archaeological evidence and ancient sources reveal a people who are deeply spiritual but also pragmatic. Carian religion emphasized the connection between the divine and the natural world. Their gods were associated with specific mountains, springs, and groves. This wasn't abstract theology, but lived religion that connected daily life to sacred space. One particularly fascinating aspect of Carian religion was their treatment of sacred groves. These weren't just random patches of forest, but carefully maintained religious sites where specific trees were believed to house divine spirits. Ancient sources describe elaborate festivals held in these groves, with processions, sacrifices, and ritual meals that could last for days. The Carians also developed distinctive funerary religions that would influence the entire ancient world. They believed that the dead continued to play active roles in the community, requiring not just burial, but ongoing care and attention. This belief system would reach its ultimate expression in the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, but it's visible in hundreds of smaller tombs throughout Caria, each one a testament to the Carian belief that death was not an ending, but a transformation. If you want to understand a civilization, look at how they treated their dead. By this measure, the Carians were one of the most sophisticated and emotionally complex societies of the ancient world. Their approach to death and burial reveals a people who saw the afterlife not as a distant abstraction, but as an immediate continuation of earthly relationships and responsibilities. The story of Carian funerary customs begins with their fundamental belief that the dead remained active members of the community. This wasn't ancestor worship in the sense that we might understand it from other cultures, but something more intimate and ongoing. The dead were expected to continue providing guidance and protection to their families, while the living had obligations to ensure the comfort and dignity of the deceased. This philosophy manifested in burial practices that were both elaborate and deeply personal. Unlike many ancient cultures that developed standardized burial rituals, the Carians seemed to tailor their funerary practices to the individual. We see this in the incredible diversity of tomb types found throughout Caria, from simple rock-cut chambers to elaborate multi-story monuments that rival small palaces in their complexity. Let me describe one of the most striking examples, the tomb of Amyntas at Phtiae, ancient Telmessos. Carved directly into the living rock of a cliff face, this tomb looks like a temple facade complete with columns, pediments, and intricate decorative details. But here's what makes it remarkable. Every element of the design reflects not just artistic skill, but deep personal knowledge of the deceased. The choice of architectural style, the specific decorative motifs, even the positioning on the cliff, all would have carried meaning for those who knew Amyntas in life. The Carians were also innovators in funerary art. Their sarcophagi, elaborate stone coffins, represent some of the finest sculptural work of the ancient world. These weren't mass-produced items, but individual works of art, each one telling the story of a specific life. The scenes carved on their sides might depict the deceased's profession, their family relationships, their religious beliefs, or their personal achievements. One particularly moving example is the so-called Mourning Women sarcophagus from Sidon, created by Carian artists. The sides of this sarcophagus are decorated with figures of women in various poses of grief, some weeping, others pulling their hair, still others raising their hands to the heavens in supplication. What makes this so powerful is that these aren't generic mourning figures, but individual portraits, each woman expressing grief in her own personal way. But perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Carian funerary custom was their practice of creating tomb complexes that served multiple generations. These weren't just burial places, but family compounds, where the living could come to feast with the dead, seek their advice, and maintain family bonds across the boundaries of death. Archaeological excavation of these sites has revealed elaborate dining rooms, kitchens, and even guest quarters, all designed to accommodate regular visits from family members. The scale of some of these complexes is breathtaking. The tomb complex at Bellevue, built for a Carian noble in the 3rd century BCE, covers several acres and includes not just burial chambers but gardens, workshops, and residential quarters for the priests and servants who maintained the site. This wasn't just a tomb, it was a small city dedicated to the memory and ongoing presence of the dead. These practices had profound social implications. The investment required to create and maintain such elaborate funerary complexes meant that death became a way of demonstrating and cementing social status. But it also created networks of obligation and relationship that extended far beyond the nuclear family. The priests who maintained tomb complexes, the artists who decorated them, the servants who prepared ritual meals, all became part of extended family networks centered on the memory of the deceased. This approach to death and burial would reach its ultimate expression in the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. But we need to understand that Mausolus's tomb wasn't an aberration or an example of royal excess. It was the culmination of centuries of Carian innovation in funerary art and architecture, the final flowering of a tradition that saw death not as an ending, but as the beginning of a new form of social relationship. When we talk about ancient art, our minds often jump immediately to the great masterpieces, the Parthenon sculptures, the Venus de Milo, the frescoes of Pompeii. But some of the most revealing and beautiful art from the ancient world comes from places that rarely make it into art history textbooks. Carian art is one of these hidden treasures, and it offers us an incredibly intimate window into daily life, beliefs, and values in the ancient Mediterranean. Carian pottery, in particular, tells stories that official monuments and grand sculptures simply cannot. Take, for example, the distinctive Carian cups found throughout the region. Small, elegant drinking vessels decorated not with mythological scenes or heroic narratives, but with images of everyday life. We see farmers tending their fields, merchants haggling in markets, children playing games, women weaving at looms. These aren't the sanitized images of idealized life that we often find in official art, but glimpses of real people going about their daily business. What makes Carian pottery especially interesting is its technical innovation. Carian potters were among the first in the Mediterranean world to master a distinctive glazing technique that produced a lustrous, almost metallic finish. This wasn't just decorative. The glaze made vessels more durable and water-resistant, perfect for a people who were active in maritime trade. But the Carians didn't stop at functionality. They used this technique to create some of the most visually striking ceramics of the ancient world. The decorative motifs on Carian pottery reflect the cosmopolitan nature of their society. You'll find traditional Anatolian symbols like the double axe alongside Greek geometric patterns, Persian-influenced animal friezes, and Egyptian lotus motifs. But these aren't random borrowings. Carian artists had a remarkable ability to synthesize diverse influences into coherent, distinctly Carian artistic statements. One particularly beautiful example is a series of painted amphora from Halicarnassus dating to the 5th century BCE. The main decorative band shows a procession of figures that initially appears to be a typical Greek religious scene until you look more closely. The clothing, the musical instruments, the ritual gestures are all distinctly Carian. The artist has used Greek artistic conventions to depict a purely Carian religious ceremony. creating a visual fusion that perfectly captures the bicultural nature of Carian society. Carian sculpture presents an even more complex picture. Unlike pottery, which was primarily produced for local use, Carian sculpture was created both for domestic consumption and for export to the broader Mediterranean world. This dual market created an interesting artistic tension. Carian sculptors needed to be fluent in international artistic languages while maintaining their distinctive local character. The solution they developed was remarkably sophisticated. For international clients, they could produce work that was indistinguishable from the best Greek or Persian sculpture of their day. But for local patrons, they developed a distinctive Carian style that emphasized emotional expression and individual character over idealized beauty. This isn't to say that Carian sculpture was less skillful, quite the opposite. It required enormous technical ability to create portraits that captured not just physical appearance but personality and emotion. The portrait sculptures from Carian tomb complexes are particularly striking in this regard. Instead of the serene, timeless expressions we associate with classical Greek sculpture, Carian portraits show people who look like real individuals with real emotions. We see faces marked by experience, expressions that suggest specific moods and thoughts, poses that capture people in moments of action or contemplation. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Carian art is its integration with architecture and landscape. Carian artists didn't think of their work as separate objects to be admired in isolation, but as elements in larger artistic environments. A painted vase was designed to be seen in a specific room with specific lighting as part of a coordinated decorative scheme. A portrait sculpture was created to occupy a particular niche in a tomb complex, where it would interact with wall paintings, architectural details, and the natural landscape visible through windows or doorways. This integrated approach to art reached its highest expression in the great Carian tomb complexes, where painting, sculpture, architecture, and landscape design combined to create immersive artistic experiences. Walking through one of these complexes would have been like moving through a three-dimensional work of art, where every view was carefully composed and every element contributed to the overall emotional and spiritual impact. The influence of Carian artistic innovation extended far beyond Caria itself. Carian artists worked throughout the ancient world, bringing their techniques and aesthetic sensibilities to projects in Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. They were particularly sought after as tomb decorators, and examples of Carian-influenced funerary art can be found from Spain to Central Asia. When we think about ancient architecture, we often focus on temples and public buildings, the structures that were meant to impress and inspire. But Carian architecture tells a different story, one where the most innovative and emotionally powerful buildings were private structures designed to serve the needs of families and communities across generations. This doesn't mean that Carian public architecture was unimpressive, far from it. The temple complex at Lebronda, which I mentioned earlier, represents one of the most sophisticated examples of sacred architecture in the ancient world. But what makes Carian architecture unique is the way it integrated public and private, sacred and secular, monumental and intimate. Let's start with their approach to urban planning. Unlike many ancient cities that grew organically around a central acropolis or marketplace, Carian cities were often planned as integrated environments where residential, commercial and religious districts were carefully coordinated. Halicarnassus is a perfect example of this approach. The city wasn't just a collection of buildings, but a designed landscape where the natural topography of the peninsula was enhanced and modified to create dramatic visual effects. The residential architecture of Caria is particularly revealing. Wealthy Carian families didn't just build houses, they created compounds that served multiple generations and incorporated spaces for both daily life and ritual activities. These weren't just larger versions of ordinary houses, but architecturally sophisticated complexes that reflected distinctly Carian values and social structures. A typical elite Carian residence might include separate living quarters for different family members, workshops for craftsmen and servants, storage areas for trade goods, guest quarters for visiting merchants or dignitaries, private shrines for family religious ceremonies, and elaborate dining halls where extended family and friends could gather for feasts and celebrations. But the most distinctive feature was usually a memorial court or garden dedicated to deceased family members, where their portraits and personal belongings were displayed, and where regular ritual meals were held in their honor. The architectural techniques used in these complexes were remarkably advanced. Carian builders were masters of stone construction, capable of creating structures that have survived for over 2 millennia. But they were also innovators in the use of different materials. They pioneered techniques for combining stone, timber, and ceramic elements in ways that were both structurally sound and visually striking. One particularly impressive example is the technique they developed for creating large interior spaces without interior support columns. By using a combination of advanced stone-cutting techniques and carefully engineered timber frameworks, they could create dining halls and assembly spaces that were far larger than anything possible with traditional post and lintel construction. Some of these spaces could accommodate hundreds of people for religious ceremonies or family celebrations. But it's in their funerary architecture that the Carians truly excelled. The rock-cut tombs of Lycia, while technically outside Caria proper, were created by Carian artists and reflect Carian architectural principles. These tombs are carved directly into cliff faces, creating facades that look like temple fronts or palace entrances. But the real architectural sophistication is on the interior, where complex systems of chambers, corridors, and courtyards create spaces for burial, ritual, and ongoing family activities. The engineering required for these projects was extraordinary. The tomb complexes had to be waterproof, structurally sound, and accessible for regular use while being carved into living rock. This required not just artistic skill, but sophisticated understanding of geology, hydrology, and structural engineering. The fact that so many of these tombs are still in excellent condition after more than 2,000 years testifies to the skill of their builders. The crowning achievement of Carian architecture, of course, was the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. But before we discuss that monument in detail, it's important to understand that it wasn't an isolated achievement. It was the culmination of centuries of architectural innovation and the ultimate expression of distinctly Carian values about death, memory, and the relationship between architecture and landscape. The mausoleum combined elements from multiple architectural traditions: Greek temple design, Persian royal tomb concepts, Egyptian pyramid construction techniques, and indigenous Anatolian building practices. But the result wasn't an eclectic mixture of borrowed elements. It was a coherent architectural statement that represented the synthesis of Mediterranean architectural knowledge under the guidance of distinctly Carian aesthetic sensibilities. What made the mausoleum truly remarkable wasn't just its size or the quality of its decoration, but the way it integrated with its urban environment. The tomb wasn't built in isolation, but as part of a comprehensive redesign of Halicarnassus that created visual relationships between the monument, the harbour, the residential districts, and the surrounding landscape. From certain vantage points in the city, the mausoleum would appear to rise directly from the sea, creating an almost magical effect that reinforced its role as a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. This integration of architecture with landscape was typically Carian. They didn't see buildings as isolated objects, but as elements in larger compositions that included natural features, gardens, water systems, and sight lines. A Carian architect would consider not just how a building looked, but how it would appear from different approaches, how it would change in different lighting conditions, how it would interact with seasonal changes in vegetation, and how it would serve the needs of users across multiple generations. Picture this scene. It's 650 BCE, and you're standing on the walls of Memphis, ancient capital of Egypt. Below you stretches the Nile Delta, but what catches your attention isn't the river or the palm groves. It's the military camp that's been established just outside the city. Rows of orderly tents, weapon racks gleaming in the sun, and groups of soldiers training with an intensity and precision that's clearly professional. These aren't Egyptian conscripts or foreign slaves pressed into service. These are Carian mercenaries, and their reputation for military excellence has brought them all the way from their Anatolian homeland to serve the pharaoh. This scene wasn't unusual. It was playing out across the ancient world, from Egypt to Mesopotamia, from the Black Sea to the shores of North Africa. The Carians had developed something unprecedented in the ancient Mediterranean, a professional military culture that treated warfare not as a seasonal obligation or a last resort for self-defense, but as a skilled craft worthy of lifelong dedication. What made the Carians such formidable warriors? Part of the answer lies in their geography. The mountainous terrain of Caria created natural warriors, people accustomed to moving through difficult terrain, capable of carrying heavy loads over long distances, and skilled in the kind of individual combat that mountain warfare demanded. But geography alone doesn't explain their success. The Carians transformed these natural advantages into a systematic approach to military training that was centuries ahead of its time. Unlike the citizen soldiers of Greek city-states, who typically trained for warfare only when civic duties demanded it, Carian warriors often began their military education in childhood. Young Carian men didn't just learn to fight, they learned to think strategically, to maintain equipment, to understand logistics, and to work effectively in small groups under extreme conditions. This wasn't just military training, it was professional education. The weapons and armor that archaeologists have recovered from Carian sites tell the story of a people who were constantly innovating in military technology. They were among the first to master the production of high-quality iron weapons, and their armor showed influences from across the Mediterranean world. Greek helmets modified for better visibility, Persian-style scale armor adapted for greater mobility, shields designed with unique grip systems that allowed for more flexible fighting styles. But perhaps most importantly, the Carians developed distinctive tactical approaches that made them invaluable to ancient commanders. They excelled at what we might today call special operations, small unit tactics, reconnaissance, mountain warfare, and amphibious operations. These weren't the kinds of military skills needed for the set-piece battles between phalanx formations that dominated Greek warfare. But they were exactly what ancient empires needed for the complex military challenges of governing diverse territories. Herodotus tells us that the Carians claimed to have invented several important military innovations, including the use of crests on helmets, the attachment of handles to shields, and the decoration of shields with personal devices. While we can't verify these claims historically, they reflect the Carian reputation for military innovation and their pride in their warrior culture. The evidence for Carian military excellence isn't just literary, it's archaeological. Carian weapons and armor have been found in graves across the Mediterranean, often far from Caria itself. These weren't trade goods, but personal possessions of Carian warriors who died in foreign service. The quality of these finds is consistently high, indicating that even rank-and-file Carian soldiers had access to excellent equipment. But the most compelling evidence for Carian military reputation is the simple fact that they were in such demand. From the 7th century BCE onward, Carian mercenaries served in armies throughout the ancient world. They weren't just foot soldiers, they often served as officers, military advisors, and specialists in siege warfare and naval combat. This kind of career mobility was virtually unknown for other mercenary peoples of the ancient world. The Carians also developed a sophisticated understanding of military logistics that made them valuable not just as fighters, but as military organizers. They understood how to maintain supply lines over long distances, how to establish temporary fortifications, how to coordinate land and sea operations, and how to adapt their tactics to local conditions. These skills made them particularly valuable to the Persian Empire, which needed military specialists capable of operating across vast distances and diverse terrains. One particularly fascinating aspect of Carian military culture was their approach to military honor. Unlike many ancient warrior cultures that emphasized individual heroics and personal glory, the Carians developed a more collective approach to military honor. Success was measured not just by personal prowess in combat, but by the success of the unit and the completion of the mission. This made them ideal mercenaries, reliable, disciplined, and focused on achieving their employer's objectives rather than pursuing personal glory. The transformation of the Carians from local warriors defending their mountain valleys into the ancient world's most sought-after mercenaries is one of the most remarkable military developments of the classical period. This wasn't just a matter of economic necessity or political circumstance. It represented a fundamental reimagining of what it meant to be a soldier and how military service could function in the complex, interconnected world of the ancient Mediterranean. The earliest evidence for Carian mercenary service comes from Egypt during the 26th dynasty, around 664 BCE. The pharaoh Psamtik I was facing internal rebellions and external threats, and his native Egyptian forces weren't sufficient to maintain order. Rather than relying on unreliable foreign allies or conscripted peasants, he made a revolutionary decision. He hired professional Carian soldiers to serve as the backbone of his army. This decision transformed Egyptian military history. The Carians weren't just temporary reinforcements. They became a permanent part of the Egyptian military establishment. They were granted land near Memphis, allowed to marry Egyptian women, and encouraged to settle permanently in Egypt. Their descendants would serve Egyptian pharaohs for centuries, creating a military caste that combined Carian fighting traditions with Egyptian institutional knowledge. But why were the Carians so successful as mercenaries when other peoples weren't? The answer lies in their unique combination of military skill, cultural adaptability, and professional reliability. Unlike many ancient peoples who maintained rigid cultural identities even when serving foreign masters, the Carians had a remarkable ability to adapt to local conditions while maintaining their essential military effectiveness. This adaptability extended to every aspect of military service. Carian mercenaries could learn local languages quickly, adapt to different tactical systems, work effectively with foreign officers, and understand the political contexts in which they were operating. They weren't just hired swords, they were military professionals who understood that their success depended on the success of their employers. The scale of Carian mercenary service was enormous. By the 5th century BCE, Carian soldiers were serving in armies from Spain to Central Asia. They formed the backbone of Persian imperial forces, served as marine units in Phoenician navies, worked as military engineers for Greek tyrants, and provided security for trade routes across the ancient world. Some estimates suggest that at any given time during the classical period, tens of thousands of Carian men were serving as mercenaries far from their homeland. This massive outflow of military manpower might have weakened Caria itself, but the opposite proved to be true. The wealth that mercenary service brought back to Caria funded massive building projects, supported flourishing arts and crafts industries, and allowed Carian cities to maintain their independence even when surrounded by much larger empires. Mercenary service had become not just a military tradition, but an economic foundation for Carian society. The organization of Carian mercenary service was remarkably sophisticated. Rather than individual soldiers seeking employment wherever they could find it, the Carians developed systematic approaches to military recruitment and deployment. Wealthy Carian families often specialized in providing military services, maintaining networks of contacts throughout the Mediterranean, and guaranteeing the quality and reliability of the soldiers they provided. These military contractors, for that's essentially what they were, maintained training facilities in Caria where young men could learn not just fighting skills, but languages, customs, and specialized techniques needed for different types of military service. Some facilities specialized in training naval personnel, others focused on siege warfare specialists. Still others trained bodyguards for foreign rulers. The contracts that governed Carian mercenary service were detailed and legally sophisticated. They specified not just wages and duration of service, but provisions for medical care, death benefits for families, transportation costs, equipment maintenance, and procedures for resolving disputes. These weren't simple employment agreements, but complex legal documents that reflected the professional nature of Carian military service. One of the most interesting aspects of Carian mercenary culture was their approach to loyalty. While they served foreign masters faithfully during the terms of their contracts, they maintained strong connections to their homeland and to fellow Carian soldiers serving elsewhere. This created informal networks of information and mutual support that spanned the ancient world. A Carian serving in Egypt might receive news about opportunities in Mesopotamia through other Carians serving in Greek cities, creating a kind of ancient military job market. This network also served important cultural functions. Carian mercenaries often maintained traditional religious practices even when serving in foreign armies, and they frequently sent portions of their wages back to Caria to support temple construction and maintenance. In this way, Mercenary service actually strengthened rather than weakened Carian cultural identity. The reputation for reliability that Carian mercenaries developed had profound political implications. Ancient rulers competed to hire Carian units, not just because of their fighting skills, but because of their reputation for honoring their contracts. In a world where military betrayal was common and mercenary units often switched sides based on immediate advantage, the Carians' professional integrity made them invaluable. This reliability came at a premium. Carian mercenaries typically commanded higher wages than soldiers from other regions. But employers were willing to pay these higher costs because they knew that Carian units would perform as promised and wouldn't defect at crucial moments. This reputation for reliability became a form of brand identity that the Carians carefully cultivated and protected. The relationship between the Carians and the Greeks is one of the most fascinating and complex cultural interactions of the ancient world. It wasn't a simple story of civilization meeting barbarism, or of conquest and submission, but rather a centuries-long dance of mutual influence, competition, cooperation, and transformation that ultimately enriched both cultures. When Greek colonists first began establishing settlements along the Anatolian coast in the 8th century BCE, they encountered not primitive tribes, but sophisticated Carian city-states with their own political systems, trade networks, and cultural traditions. The Greeks weren't arriving as conquerors, but as neighbors, and the relationships that developed reflected this reality. The early interactions were primarily commercial. Greek merchants were interested in the goods that Carian traders could provide: precious metals from the Anatolian interior, high-quality textiles, specialized crafts, and access to trade routes reaching deep into Asia. The Carians, for their part, were eager for Greek-manufactured goods, particularly pottery and metalwork, as well as access to Greek trade networks throughout the Mediterranean. But commerce led to much more complex relationships. Intermarriage between Greek and Carian families became common, particularly among the elite. These weren't just strategic alliances, but genuine cultural exchanges that created families with dual identities and complex loyalties. The children of these unions often became cultural intermediaries, equally comfortable in Greek symposiums and Carian religious festivals, fluent in both languages, and capable of navigating both cultural systems. This cultural mixing created some of the most interesting figures of the ancient world. Take Herodotus himself. The father of history was born in Halicarnassus, to a family that was probably of mixed Greek and Carian ancestry. His unique perspective on the world, his interest in diverse cultures, and his ability to see events from multiple viewpoints may well have been shaped by this bicultural background. When Herodotus describes various peoples and their customs, he's not writing as a Greek outsider looking at foreign exotica, but as someone who understood from personal experience how different cultural traditions could coexist and enrich each other. The political relationships between Greeks and Carians were equally complex. Some Carian cities allied themselves closely with Greek polis, adopting Greek political systems and participating in Greek interstate politics. Others maintained their traditional political structures while engaging in diplomatic relationships with Greek states. Still others found themselves caught between competing Greek factions, forced to navigate carefully between rival powers. The Persian Wars created particularly complex situations for the Carians. When the Persian Empire incorporated both Greek cities and Carian territories into its administrative system, traditional ethnic loyalties became tangled with imperial politics. Some Carian cities found themselves fighting alongside Greeks against Persian forces, while others served loyally in Persian armies against Greek enemies. These weren't simple choices between freedom and tyranny, but complex decisions based on local conditions, family relationships, and long-term strategic calculations. The cultural exchange wasn't one-directional. While the Carians certainly adopted many aspects of Greek culture, particularly in art, architecture, and literature, they also contributed significantly to Greek cultural development. Carian religious practices influenced Greek mystery cults, Carian military techniques were adopted by Greek armies, and Carian artistic styles can be seen in Greek sculpture and painting from the Archaic period onward. Perhaps most importantly, The Carians challenged Greek assumptions about cultural superiority. The Greeks initially used the term barbarian to describe anyone who didn't speak Greek, literally, people who said bar instead of intelligible words. But their extensive interactions with the Carians forced them to recognize that language difference didn't necessarily mean cultural inferiority. The Carians were obviously sophisticated, wealthy, and militarily formidable. They had their own literary traditions, philosophical schools, and artistic achievements. This recognition led to a gradual shift in Greek thinking about cultural difference. By the classical period, educated Greeks distinguished between barbarians, who were genuinely primitive, and barbarians, who simply had different but equally valid cultural traditions. The Carians, along with peoples like the Lydians and Persians, fell into the latter category, foreigners to be respected rather than despised. The linguistic interactions between Greeks and Carians were particularly fascinating. While many Carians learned to speak Greek fluently, they maintained their own language for internal communication and religious purposes. But they also influenced the development of Greek dialects in western Anatolia. The Greek spoken in cities like Miletus and Ephesus incorporated Carian loanwords and grammatical structures, creating distinctive regional varieties of Greek that reflected the multicultural environment of the Anatolian coast. In the realm of religion, the exchanges were profound and lasting. Greek colonists often found that Carian deities shared characteristics with their own gods, leading to syncretic religious practices that combined elements from both traditions. The cult of Apollo at Didyma, one of the most important oracular sites in the Greek world, incorporated Carian religious practices and attracted pilgrims from both ethnic communities. The Carians also influenced Greek military development in ways that extended far beyond mercenary service. Greek armies adopted Carian innovations in armor design, siege warfare techniques, and small unit tactics. The famous Greek hoplite phalanx, often seen as the ultimate expression of Greek military genius, actually incorporated elements that the Greeks learned from their Carian neighbors and allies. By the Hellenistic period, the distinction between Greek and Carian had become increasingly blurred, at least among the educated elite. Wealthy Carian families patronized Greek poets and philosophers, while Greek intellectuals studied Carian religious traditions and historical records. The cultural synthesis that resulted wasn't the triumph of Greek civilization over barbarian primitiveness, but the creation of a genuinely multicultural society that drew strength from its diversity. The arrival of Persian power in western Anatolia around 545 BCE marked a crucial turning point in Carian history, but it wasn't the catastrophe that we might expect. Unlike many conquered peoples who found Persian rule oppressive or culturally destructive, the Carians adapted to Persian administration with remarkable success, eventually becoming one of the most important and trusted components of the Achaemenid Empire. The Persian conquest of Lydia under Cyrus the Great brought Persian authority to the borders of Caria, but the incorporation of Carian territories into the Persian administrative system was a gradual process that relied more on negotiation than force. The Persian approach to imperial administration was sophisticated and pragmatic. Rather than attempting to impose uniform Persian culture and institutions throughout their vast empire, they preferred to work through existing local power structures, allowing conquered peoples to maintain their traditional ways of life as long as they provided tribute and military service. For the Carians, this approach was almost ideal. Their existing political system, based on autonomous city-states and tribal territories under the leadership of local dynasts, could be easily integrated into the Persian satrapal system. Carian leaders who submitted to Persian authority found themselves confirmed in their positions, now ruling as Persian appointees, but maintaining most of their traditional prerogatives. The economic implications of Persian rule were largely positive for Caria. The Carians gained access to the vast Persian trade network, which extended from India to Egypt and from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf. Carian merchants could now travel safely throughout this enormous economic zone, protected by Persian law and Persian military power. The tribute payments required by the Persian system were significant but not crushing. and they were offset by the increased prosperity that came from participation in imperial trade networks. Militarily, Persian rule transformed the Carians from regional mercenaries into imperial specialists. The Persian Empire needed exactly the kinds of military skills that the Carians had developed: professional soldiers capable of operating in diverse environments, specialists in naval warfare and amphibious operations, and officers who could command mixed units drawn from different ethnic groups. Carian military leaders found themselves serving not just as hired soldiers, but as senior officers in the imperial military hierarchy. This military integration had profound cultural implications. Carian officers serving in different parts of the Persian Empire encountered peoples and traditions from across Asia and Africa. They brought this knowledge back to Caria, contributing to the cosmopolitan character that would distinguish Carian culture during the Persian period. Carian art from this era shows influences from Persian, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Indian sources, all synthesized into distinctive Carian artistic statements. The religious policies of the Persian Empire also suited Carian traditions. The Persians generally allowed conquered peoples to maintain their traditional religious practices, requiring only that they acknowledge the supremacy of the Persian king and participate in certain imperial ceremonies. For the Carians, who had always been religiously tolerant and willing to incorporate foreign deities into their pantheon, this was hardly a burden. Indeed, some Carian religious sites actually flourished under Persian rule. The sanctuary at Labronda received significant Persian patronage, possibly because Persian officials recognized its importance in maintaining Carian loyalty to the empire. The architectural improvements made to the site during the Persian period reflect not just Persian wealth, but Persian understanding of the connection between religious satisfaction and political stability. The Persian period also saw important developments in Carian political organization. While maintaining their traditional local autonomies, the Carians began to develop more sophisticated administrative institutions capable of interfacing effectively with Persian imperial bureaucracy. This required new classes of educated administrators, scribes, and interpreters, leading to increased literacy and the development of more complex legal and commercial systems. Perhaps most importantly, Persian rule exposed the Carians to new ideas about political organization and imperial administration. While they maintained their loyalty to local dynasts and traditional institutions, they also developed an appreciation for the benefits of participation in larger political structures. This experience would prove crucial during the later Hellenistic period, when the Carians would need to navigate between competing Macedonian kingdoms. The archaeological record from Persian period Caria reveals a society that was prosperous, culturally dynamic, and increasingly sophisticated. Persian period Carian cities show evidence of substantial construction projects, including new fortifications, expanded harbors, improved water systems, and enlarged residential districts. These weren't the desperate defensive measures of a conquered people, but the confident investments of a society that expected continued prosperity and growth. The Persian period culminated in the extraordinary career of Mausolus, who ruled Caria as a Persian satrap from 377 to 353 BCE. Mausolus represented the ultimate synthesis of Carian tradition and Persian imperial service, a local dynast who maintained his people's cultural identity while serving effectively as a Persian administrator and military commander. Under Mausolus, Caria reached heights of prosperity and cultural achievement that it had never before attained. His court at Halicarnassus became a center of artistic and intellectual activity that rivaled Athens or Alexandria. Artists, poets, philosophers, and scholars from throughout the Mediterranean world came to Halicarnassus, attracted by Mausolus's patronage and the cosmopolitan atmosphere of his court. But perhaps most remarkably, Mausolus managed to use his position within the Persian system to advance specifically Carian interests. He expanded Carian territory, strengthened Carian institutions, and promoted Carian culture, all while maintaining his loyalty to the Persian Empire. His success demonstrated that it was possible to be simultaneously a good Persian satrap and a champion of local Carian identity. In the annals of ancient history, few figures embody the complexity and sophistication of their age, quite like Mausolus, satrap of Caria from 377 to 353 BCE. His story is one of political brilliance, cultural patronage, and architectural ambition that culminated in the creation of one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. But to understand Mausolus properly, we need to see him not just as the man who built a magnificent tomb, but as a ruler who transformed Caria into one of the most prosperous and culturally dynamic regions of the ancient Mediterranean. Mausolus came to power during a period of crisis for the Persian Empire. The empire was vast, but increasingly difficult to govern effectively, and provincial satraps were gaining more autonomy by necessity, if not by design. For someone with Mausolus's vision and ambition, this presented an extraordinary opportunity. He could serve Persian interests while simultaneously building what was essentially an independent Carian state within the imperial framework. His first major achievement was the unification of Caria under his personal rule. Previous Carian leaders had controlled individual cities or tribal territories, but Mausolus systematically brought all of Caria under his direct authority. This wasn't accomplished through conquest alone, though he certainly used military force when necessary, but through a sophisticated combination of diplomacy, economic incentives, and political maneuvering. The centerpiece of this unification was his decision to move the capital from Mylasa to Halicarnassus. This wasn't just a change of administrative convenience, it was a bold statement about Carian identity and ambitions. Halicarnassus was a coastal city with an excellent harbor, perfectly positioned to control maritime trade routes between the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean. By making it his capital, Mausolus was signaling that Caria would be a major player in Mediterranean politics and economics. The transformation of Halicarnassus under Mausolus was extraordinary. When he moved his court there, it was a moderately prosperous Greek colony with perhaps 20,000 inhabitants. By the time of his death, it had become one of the most magnificent cities of the ancient world, with a population that may have reached 100,000. This growth wasn't accidental. It was the result of careful planning and massive investment. Mausolus didn't just build a bigger city, he created a new kind of urban environment. Halicarnassus under his rule became genuinely multicultural in ways that were unprecedented in the ancient world. Greek colonists lived alongside Carian natives, Persian administrators worked with local merchants, and the city attracted immigrants from throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. The key to making this work was Mausolus's policy of cultural tolerance combined with economic opportunity. The economic policies that Mausolus implemented were remarkably sophisticated. He understood that Caria's prosperity depended on its position as a bridge between Asia and Europe, and he systematically developed the infrastructure needed to maximize this advantage. New harbors were built, roads were improved, market facilities were expanded, and legal systems were streamlined to facilitate trade. He even established what was essentially an ancient chamber of commerce to promote Carian business interests throughout the Persian Empire. But Mausolus wasn't just a successful administrator. He was also a patron of the arts and learning on a scale that rivaled the greatest rulers of his age. His court attracted artists, poets, historians, and philosophers from throughout the known world. The historian Herodotus, though he died before Mausolus came to power, was honored as a native son of Halicarnassus. The court became a center for the preservation and study of Carian history and traditions, even as it embraced the broader cosmopolitan culture of the Persian Empire. The artistic patronage of Mausolus had profound and lasting effects. Carian artists working under his sponsorship developed new techniques that would influence Mediterranean art for centuries. The sculptural school that emerged at Halicarnassus produced some of the finest portrait sculpture of the ancient world, characterized by psychological depth and emotional expressiveness that went far beyond the idealized forms of classical Greek art. Mausolus also initiated major architectural projects throughout Caria, not just in his capital, but in cities and sanctuaries across his territory. The improvements to the sanctuary at Labronda, which I mentioned earlier, were largely funded by Mausolus. He understood that maintaining traditional religious sites was crucial for maintaining the loyalty of his Carian subjects, even as he promoted the cosmopolitan culture of his court. His military policies were equally sophisticated. While maintaining the traditional Carian excellence in professional military service, Mausolus also developed what was essentially a national army, capable of defending Carian interests independently. This force was small by Persian standards, but highly professional and equipped with the best available weapons and armor. More importantly, it was loyal specifically to Mausolus and to Carian interests, rather than to the Persian Empire generally. This military independence allowed Mausolus to pursue foreign policies that sometimes diverged from Persian imperial interests. He formed alliances with Greek cities, supported Egyptian rebels against Persian rule, and generally acted as an independent ruler rather than a Persian administrator. Remarkably, he managed to do this without losing Persian support. His value to the empire as a stabilizing force in western Anatolia was too great for the Persian court to risk antagonizing him. The reign of Mausolus represented the culmination of centuries of Carian political and cultural development. He had successfully synthesized all the diverse influences that had shaped Carian civilization: indigenous Anatolian traditions, Greek cultural innovations, Persian administrative expertise, and Egyptian artistic techniques, into a coherent and powerful state that was uniquely Carian. But perhaps his most lasting achievement was recognizing that cultural patronage and architectural magnificence were not just personal luxuries, but essential tools of statecraft. The artists, scholars, and craftsmen who flocked to his court didn't just enhance his personal prestige. They created a cultural environment that made Halicarnassus attractive to merchants, diplomats, and skilled workers from throughout the Mediterranean world. This understanding of culture as a form of political power would reach its ultimate expression in the monument that Mausolus planned for his own burial. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus wasn't just a tomb, it was a manifesto about the nature of power, memory, and cultural achievement that would influence rulers for centuries to come. When Mausolus died in 353 BCE, his widow and sister Artemisia faced a challenge that would have daunted any ruler. How do you create a memorial worthy of a man who had transformed not just his own kingdom, but the entire conception of what a regional ruler could achieve? Her solution was audacious beyond anything previously attempted. She would build a tomb so magnificent, so architecturally revolutionary, that it would stand as one of the supreme achievements of human civilization. The word mausoleum has entered our vocabulary as a generic term for any grand tomb, but we sometimes forget that it originated as the specific name of this one extraordinary building. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus wasn't just large, though it certainly was that. Standing over 140 feet high, it was conceptually revolutionary, a new type of building that combined elements from multiple architectural traditions into something entirely unprecedented. Let me take you on a tour of this vanished wonder, reconstructed from ancient descriptions and archaeological evidence. Approaching Halicarnassus from the sea, the first thing you would notice is how the mausoleum dominates the city's skyline. Unlike Egyptian pyramids, which sat in isolated desert settings, or Greek temples, which were typically placed on elevated acropolises, the mausoleum was integrated into the urban fabric of the city, while still commanding views from every direction. The building rose from a massive stone platform that served both architectural and symbolic functions. This wasn't just a foundation, it was a statement about the relationship between earthly power and eternal memory. The platform raised the tomb above the everyday life of the city, while providing space for the elaborate ceremonies that were central to Carian funerary traditions. Above this platform rose what was essentially a Greek temple, but larger and more ornately decorated than any temple previously built. The columns weren't just structural elements, they were canvases for sculptural decoration that told the story of Mausolus's life and achievements. Between the columns stood portrait statues of Mausolus, his family, and the great figures of Carian history, creating a kind of three-dimensional chronicle of his dynasty and his people. But the most revolutionary aspect of the mausoleum was what sat above this temple level: a stepped pyramid that drew inspiration from both Mesopotamian ziggurats and Egyptian pyramids, while being distinctly different from both. This pyramid wasn't a solid mass of stone, but a sophisticated architectural composition that provided both structural support and visual drama. The pyramid was crowned by a massive sculptural group showing Mausolus and Artemisia in a four-horse chariot. The whole group carved from single blocks of marble with a skill that amazed even ancient observers accustomed to the finest Greek sculpture. This wasn't just decoration. It was a powerful statement about the continuation of Mausolus's rule even after death, his ongoing presence in the life of his kingdom. The sculptural decoration of the mausoleum represented the greatest collaboration of artistic talent in the ancient world. Artemisia commissioned the four greatest sculptors of her age, Scopas, Bryaxis, Timotheus, and Leochares, to create the various elements of the monument's decoration. Each artist was responsible for one side of the building, but they worked together to create a unified artistic vision that surpassed anything any of them had achieved individually. The main sculptural program depicted the legendary battle between the Greeks and the Amazons, but this wasn't chosen randomly. In Carian tradition, Artemisia herself was seen as a kind of Amazon queen, a woman who ruled in her own right and led armies in battle. The Amazon frieze was thus both decorative and biographical, celebrating not just mythical heroines, but the real achievements of the queen who commissioned it. But the mausoleum wasn't just an artistic achievement. It was an engineering marvel. The building had to support enormous weight while remaining stable in an earthquake-prone region. The architects, Satyros and Pythios, both Greeks trained in the latest building techniques, developed innovative structural systems that distributed weight effectively while creating interior spaces suitable for the complex ceremonies of Carian death ritual. The interior of the mausoleum was as impressive as its exterior. The burial chamber was designed not just to house the remains of Mausolus and Artemisia, but to serve as the setting for ongoing ceremonies connecting the living and the dead. The space included areas for ritual meals, spaces for offerings and prayers, and chambers where family members could spend time in contemplation or communion with the deceased. The construction of the mausoleum required unprecedented coordination of resources and expertise. Marble was quarried in Greece and transported across the Aegean. Bronze was imported from Cyprus. Precious stones came from throughout the Persian Empire, and skilled craftsmen were recruited from every major artistic center of the Mediterranean world. The logistics of coordinating these resources while maintaining the highest standards of artistic quality would have challenged any modern project manager. The influence of the mausoleum extended far beyond its immediate impact as a tourist attraction and artistic wonder. Its innovative combination of Greek, Persian, and indigenous architectural elements created a new visual language that would influence monumental architecture for centuries. Roman emperors, Arab caliphs, and European kings would all draw inspiration from the mausoleum when planning their own monuments. Perhaps more importantly, the mausoleum established a new conception of what a ruler's tomb could be. Previous royal tombs had been designed either as private family monuments or as religious buildings focused on the afterlife. The mausoleum was simultaneously personal and public, religious and political, a memorial to the past and a statement about the future. The building stood for over 1,500 years, surviving earthquakes, wars, and the collapse of multiple empires. Medieval travelers described it as still largely intact, though they sometimes mistook it for a palace rather than a tomb. Its final destruction came in the 15th century, when the Knights of Rhodes dismantled it to provide stone for their fortress. Ironically, this practical reuse meant that elements of the mausoleum were incorporated into defensive walls that can still be seen today. The fragments that survive, many now in the British Museum, give us glimpses of the monument's extraordinary artistic quality. The portrait heads of Mausolus and Artemisia are among the finest examples of ancient portraiture, combining idealized beauty with individual character in ways that still seem remarkably modern. The relief sculptures show a mastery of composition and emotional expression that influenced artistic development throughout the Hellenistic world. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the mausoleum is conceptual rather than artistic. It demonstrated that regional rulers could create monuments that rivaled or surpassed those of great empires, that artistic patronage could be a form of political power, and that architecture could serve as a vehicle for complex ideas about identity, memory, and cultural achievement. The arrival of Alexander the Great in Anatolia in 334 BCE marked the beginning of the end for the independent Carian state that Mausolus and Artemisia had built. But the story of how Caria was incorporated into Alexander's empire and how the Carians adapted to yet another transformation of the Mediterranean world reveals both the resilience of Carian culture and the pragmatic political skills that had allowed them to survive for so many centuries. When Alexander crossed the Hellespont and began his conquest of the Persian Empire, Caria was ruled by Pixodarus, the youngest brother of Mausolus. Pixodarus faced an impossible situation. He owed loyalty to the Persian Empire that had confirmed his authority, but he could see that Alexander's forces were achieving victories that suggested Persian power in western Anatolia might be collapsing. The Carian response to this dilemma was characteristically pragmatic and sophisticated. Rather than waiting to be conquered or throwing his forces into a hopeless defense of Persian authority, Pixodarus initiated diplomatic contact with Alexander while the Macedonian was still besieging Halicarnassus. The negotiations that followed reveal both the complexity of ancient international relations and the remarkable diplomatic skills that the Carians had developed over centuries of navigating between greater powers. The siege of Halicarnassus itself was one of the most dramatic episodes of Alexander's Anatolian campaign. The city's fortifications, enhanced during Mausolus's reign, were among the strongest in the ancient world. The Persian garrison, supported by Carian troops loyal to Pixodarus, put up fierce resistance that required all of Alexander's military genius to overcome. But even during the siege, the political situation remained fluid. Some Carian forces fought alongside the Persians, others declared for Alexander, and still others attempted to maintain neutrality. The city's population was similarly divided. Greek residents generally favored Alexander, while Carian natives had more complex loyalties that often centered on family and tribal connections rather than imperial politics. The fall of Halicarnassus after a siege of several months didn't mean the end of Carian resistance, but it did mark a crucial turning point. Alexander's treatment of the conquered city was remarkably lenient by ancient standards. He allowed most residents to remain, protected private property, and even permitted the continuation of traditional Carian religious practices. This generous treatment was partly strategic. Alexander needed to consolidate his conquests quickly to continue his eastward march, but it also reflected his recognition of Carian importance in regional politics. The key figure in the transition from Persian to Macedonian rule was Ada, the sister of Mausolus, who had been displaced by Pixodarus in a dynastic struggle several years earlier. Ada had maintained a claim to rule Caria and controlled several strongholds in the mountainous interior when Alexander arrived. Her decision to ally herself with Alexander and offer him adoption as her son was a masterstroke of political calculation. From Alexander's perspective, this arrangement was ideal. Rather than having to impose direct Macedonian rule on a potentially hostile population, he could govern Caria through a legitimate local ruler who commanded traditional loyalty. Ada, for her part, regained power over her ancestral kingdom, while ensuring that Carian interests would be represented in the new Macedonian world order. The relationship between Alexander and Ada appears to have been genuinely warm and mutually respectful. Ancient sources describe Alexander treating her with the deference due to a mother, while she provided him with local knowledge, troops, and financial support that proved crucial for his later campaigns. Their partnership demonstrated that the Macedonian conquest didn't have to mean the destruction of local political traditions. Under Ada's rule, Caria experienced a remarkable revival. The damages from the siege of Halicarnassus were quickly repaired, new building projects were initiated, and trade relationships were re-established. The Carians adapted to Macedonian rule with the same flexibility they had shown during the Persian period, maintaining their cultural identity while embracing new opportunities for trade and cultural exchange. The cultural implications of Macedonian rule were complex and far-reaching. Alexander's conquest brought Caria into contact with the broader Hellenistic world that was emerging from the fusion of Greek and Asian cultures. Carian artists and intellectuals found new markets for their skills in the expanding Greek-speaking world, while Carian cities became stops on new trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. But perhaps most significantly, the Macedonian conquest marked the beginning of the end for Carian political independence. While Ada ruled successfully until her death around 323 BCE, her successors would face increasing pressure to conform to Hellenistic political norms. The distinctive Carian approach to governance, with its emphasis on family dynasties and traditional legitimacy, gradually gave way to the more bureaucratic systems favored by Alexander's successors. The death of Alexander in 323 BCE created new challenges and opportunities for the Carians. As his generals fought over the division of his empire, Caria found itself once again caught between competing powers. But the Carians had centuries of experience in this kind of situation, and they navigated the wars of the successors with characteristic skill and adaptability. Different Carian cities allied themselves with different Macedonian generals, hedging their bets and ensuring that whoever emerged victorious would have reasons to treat Caria favorably. This strategy worked reasonably well in the short term, but it also accelerated the fragmentation of Carian political unity that had been one of Mausolus's greatest achievements. By 280 BCE, Caria was divided between the Ptolemaic kingdom, based in Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire, centered in Syria, with some cities maintaining nominal independence. While this division meant the end of unified Carian political power, it also meant that Carian culture and traditions were preserved in multiple political contexts, ensuring their survival even as political circumstances continued to change. The Hellenistic period that followed Alexander's conquests would see important developments in Carian culture, but they would occur within the context of larger Greek-speaking kingdoms rather than an independent Carian state. The age of Carian political independence, which had lasted for over 7 centuries, had come to an end. As we reach the end of our journey through Carian history, it's worth stepping back to consider the broader significance of this remarkable civilization. The Carians may not have achieved the political dominance of Rome or the cultural influence of Athens, but their story offers profound insights into how ancient peoples navigated the complex challenges of cultural identity, political survival, and economic prosperity in a rapidly changing world. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Carian civilization was their remarkable adaptability. Over the course of more than a millennium, they successfully adapted to Greek colonization, Persian conquest, and Macedonian rule, each time finding ways to maintain their essential cultural identity while embracing new opportunities and influences. This wasn't passive survival, but active transformation, a continuous process of cultural innovation that allowed them to remain relevant and prosperous, even as the political landscape around them shifted dramatically. The Carian approach to cultural identity offers important lessons for understanding the ancient world. Unlike peoples who defined themselves primarily in opposition to their neighbors, the Carians developed a more inclusive approach to identity that allowed them to absorb foreign influences without losing their essential character. They could be simultaneously Carian and Greek, Carian and Persian, maintaining multiple loyalties and identities that modern nationalism might find contradictory, but that served them well in the multicultural world of the ancient Mediterranean. Their economic innovations were equally significant. The development of professional mercenary service wasn't just a military innovation, but an economic strategy that allowed a relatively small population to punch above their weight in international politics. By exporting military expertise, rather than just raw materials or manufactured goods, they created a sustainable competitive advantage that brought wealth and influence back to their homeland. The Carian contribution to ancient art and architecture was substantial and lasting. Their synthesis of diverse artistic traditions created new visual languages that influenced developments throughout the Mediterranean world. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus was just the most famous example of a broader pattern of artistic innovation that combined technical excellence with cultural meaning in ways that continue to resonate today. Perhaps most importantly, the Carians demonstrated that political power and cultural influence don't always correlate directly. They never ruled a vast empire or dominated international politics, But their influence on ancient civilization was profound and lasting. They showed that smaller peoples could maintain their dignity and autonomy even when surrounded by much larger powers, provided they were willing to be flexible, innovative, and pragmatic in their approach to international relations. The religious and funerary practices of the Carians reflected a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between individual identity and community belonging. Their elaborate tomb complexes weren't just expressions of personal vanity, but complex social institutions that maintained family and community bonds across generations. Their approach to death as a transformation, rather than an ending, influenced religious developments throughout the ancient world. The story of the Carians also illuminates the complex processes by which ancient cultures interacted and influenced each other. Too often, ancient history is presented as a series of discrete civilizations, Greek, Roman, Persian, Egyptian, that succeeded each other in linear progression. The Carian experience reveals a much more complex reality in which multiple cultures coexisted, competed, and collaborated in ways that enriched all participants. Their military innovations had lasting effects on ancient warfare. The development of professional mercenary service created new possibilities for small states to maintain their independence and for individuals to pursue military careers independent of ethnic or political loyalties. The tactical innovations developed by Carian military specialists influenced military development throughout the ancient world. The political legacy of the Carians is more complex, but no less significant. Their success in maintaining autonomy within larger imperial systems provided models for other regional peoples facing similar challenges. The Carian approach to diplomacy, characterized by flexibility, pragmatism, and careful attention to changing power balances, offers insights into how smaller powers can successfully navigate international politics. The architectural legacy of Carian civilization extends far beyond the famous mausoleum. Their innovations in tomb construction, urban planning, and the integration of architecture with landscape influenced building practices throughout the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. The Carian understanding of architecture as a tool for creating and maintaining social relationships offers lessons that remain relevant to contemporary urban planners and architects. In the end, the story of the Carians is a story about the resilience of human culture and the power of adaptation. They faced every challenge that the ancient world could throw at them: invasion, conquest, cultural pressure, economic disruption, political upheaval. And they not only survived, but thrived. They did this not by resisting change, but by embracing it, not by insisting on cultural purity, but by celebrating cultural synthesis, not by seeking to dominate others, but by finding ways to work with them. Their story reminds us that historical significance doesn't always correlate with political power, that cultural influence can be more lasting than military conquest, and that the willingness to adapt and change can be a source of strength rather than weakness. In our own rapidly changing world, facing our own challenges of cultural interaction and political transformation, the example of the Carians offers both inspiration and practical wisdom. The ruins scattered across the Turkish landscape, the rock-cut tombs, the temple foundations, the fragments of sculpture and architecture, are more than archaeological curiosities. They are testimonies to a people who understood that survival requires adaptation, that prosperity requires innovation, and that cultural identity is not something to be preserved unchanged, but something to be continually renewed and enriched through engagement with the wider world. As we conclude our exploration of Carian civilization, we're left not with a sense of ending, but with an appreciation of continuity. The Carians may have disappeared as a distinct political entity, but their influence continues to ripple through the centuries, visible in the art, architecture, and cultural practices of the peoples who came after them. Their story is ultimately not one of disappearance, but of transformation, a reminder that in the grand sweep of history, adaptation and influence can be more enduring than conquest and domination. In the mountains and coastlines of ancient Caria, we can still sense the presence of a remarkable people who faced the challenges of their time with creativity, courage, and wisdom. Their legacy invites us to consider how we, in our own time, might meet the challenges of cultural change and political transformation with similar grace and adaptability. The Carians remind us that the true measure of a civilization lies not in its power to dominate others, but in its capacity to enrich the human experience and contribute to the ongoing story of human cultural development.